I imagine standing at the edge of a great cliff where the land falls away into layered time, and the stone beneath my feet holds secrets older than memory itself. The air is cool here, carrying with it the faint mineral scent of exposed rock, and I find myself gazing out across a landscape that seems to whisper in the language of deep time, a language written not in words, but in the patient accumulation of sediment, in the folding and breaking of ancient stone, in the slow dance of continents across the surface of a turning world. Below me, the cliff face reveals itself in bands of color, ochre and rust, gray and cream, each layer a page in an immense book that has been writing itself for longer than the human mind can easily hold. And I trace these stripes with my eyes, following them as they extend into the distance, disappearing beneath soil and vegetation, only to emerge again miles away, telling the same story in a different voice. The rock face is not smooth, but textured with the marks of time's passage, tiny ripples frozen in sandstone that once were the bed of a shallow sea, the delicate imprints of ferns that grew in forests so ancient they predate the first flowering plants. And I think about how this solid ground beneath me is not truly solid at all, but something more fluid when measured against the vast stretches of geological time, something that flows and shifts and transforms according to laws that operate on scales both grander and more subtle than those we encounter in our brief human days. There is something deeply calming in this perspective, in the recognition that the earth beneath us is engaged in a slow conversation with itself, a conversation conducted through heat and pressure, through the patient work of water and wind, through forces that build mountains grain by grain and wear them down with equal persistence. And standing here, I feel myself becoming quiet inside, my thoughts slowing to match the pace of these ancient processes, the science of geology, I have come to understand, is the science of reading this landscape, of learning to see not just what is, but what was and what will be. It is the practice of looking at a stone and perceiving within it the story of its formation, the journey it has taken through unimaginable depths and pressures, the transformations it has undergone, and the transformations yet to come. I think about the scholars who first began to truly read these stones, who looked at the world around them and started asking questions that would reshape humanity's understanding of time itself. Questions about how valleys were carved, how mountains rose, how the shells of sea creatures came to rest on the peaks of high ranges far from any ocean, and how these observations slowly assemble themselves into a coherent vision of a dynamic Earth, a planet not static and unchanging, but alive with slow motion and transformation. The evening light slants across the landscape now, casting long shadows that emphasize every fold and fracture in the exposed rock. And I notice how the same light that illuminates these ancient surfaces also reveals their geometry, the way layers tilt and bend, the places where once horizontal beds now stand nearly vertical, evidence of forces powerful enough to reshape the very architecture of continents, yet patient enough to work over millions upon millions of years. And there is something profoundly settling in this contemplation, in allowing the mind to expand into these vast time scales, to consider processes that unfold with such patience that a human lifetime becomes less than a heartbeat, a single breath in a much longer rhythm, the rhythm of stone and time, of heat rising from the earth's deep interior and cold, descending from the surface, of materials cycling endlessly through different forms and states, each transformation governed by principles that operate with beautiful consistency across the whole span of geological time. I find myself becoming very still, my breathing slowing as I continue to observe this landscape, noticing the way the fading light catches on crystal faces embedded in the rock, the way shadows pool in the hollows worn by ancient water, the way the whole scene seems to hold within it both perfect stillness and the memory of immense movement, and I prepare to follow this thread deeper, to explore the principles and theories that allow us to read these stones, to understand the vast machinery of the earth, and to glimpse our own small place within the incomprehensible enormity of geological time. The earliest questions about the earth were born from simple observation, from the recognition that landscapes change, that rivers carve valleys, that mountains rise against the sky, and that the rocks themselves seem to tell stories if only we knew how to listen. I think about the ancient philosophers standing on shores where the land met the sea, noticing shells embedded in stone far above the waterline, and wondering how such things came to be. Their explanations often reached toward the mythological, toward great floods that reshaped the world in single catastrophic events, toward divine acts that placed these objects where they found them. And yet, within these early attempts to explain the world, there lived the seed of something profound, the understanding that the earth had a history, that it had not always been as it appeared in their present moment. The Greek thinker Xenophanes, walking the hills of his homeland more than 2,000 years ago, observed fossilized sea creatures in stone, and proposed that the land and sea had once traded places, that what was now high ground had once lain beneath the waves, and though he lacked the framework to understand the mechanisms, he had glimpsed something true, something that would take centuries more to fully comprehend. But for much of human history, until the prevailing view held that the earth was young, perhaps only thousands of years old, and that its features had been shaped rapidly through catastrophes and sudden interventions. This perspective made a certain intuitive sense because the processes that shape landscapes seemed impossibly slow when measured against a human lifetime. How could a river carve a canyon? How could sediment build into mountains? How could entire continents shift their positions unless some great violent force accomplished in days what seemed impossible over years? I imagine standing in the European countryside of the 1700s, a time when the study of rocks and minerals was beginning to organize itself into something resembling a discipline, when collectors and natural philosophers were assembling cabinets of curiosities, gathering specimens from quarries and mines, from riverbeds and coastal cliffs, and beginning to notice patterns in the arrangement of stone. Nicholas Steno, a Danish anatomist who turned his attention to the earth, made observations that would become foundational principles. He noticed that in undisturbed rock formations, the oldest layers lay at the bottom and the youngest at the top, a principle so simple it seems almost obvious, and yet it provided a key to reading the sequence of geological history. He recognized that layers of sediment were originally deposited horizontally, and that any tilting or folding must have occurred after their formation, and he understood that when a crack or intrusion cut across existing layers, the intrusion must be younger than the layers it crossed. These principles, published in 1669, gave geologists a way to establish relative chronology, to say that this formation is older than that one, even without knowing their absolute ages in years. And standing here in my imagination, in that time before these ideas became common knowledge, I can almost feel the excitement of this discovery, the recognition that the rocks beneath our feet preserve an ordered sequence of events, a narrative that could be read if we learned the language. The 18th century brought new voices to this conversation. James Hutton, a Scottish farmer and natural philosopher, spent years observing the landscape around him, watching how streams carried sediment, how valleys deepened imperceptibly season after season, how exposed rock weathered and crumbled into soil, and he began to develop a radical vision of geological time. Hutton proposed that the same processes operating today had always operated, that the earth was shaped not by catastrophe, but by the slow, patient, continuous action of everyday forces, wind and rain, heat and pressure, erosion and deposition, working over spans of time so vast they defied conventional understanding. He looked at the Scottish landscape and saw what he called no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, a vision of deep time that stretched backward and forward beyond human comprehension. I think about Hutton standing at Sicker Point on the Scottish coast, where he brought colleagues to show them something remarkable. There, the rocks told a story in stone that captured his vision perfectly. Horizontal layers of red sandstone lay atop vertical layers of much older rock, and between them ran an erosion surface, evidence of an ancient landscape that had been worn flat before the newer rocks were deposited. The angular unconformity, as it would come to be called, represented not just missing time, but incomprehensible spans of it, entire cycles of mountain building and erosion, of land rising from the sea and wearing away again, all preserved in the contact between two sets of stone. His ideas were published in 1788 in a work that challenged the prevailing view of a young earth shaped by catastrophe. But Hutton's writing was dense and difficult, his vision profound but not easily accessible, and it would take another voice to carry these ideas into wider acceptance. That voice belonged to Charles Lyell, a lawyer-turned-geologist, who in the 1830s published his Principles of Geology, a work that would become one of the most influential scientific texts of the 19th century. Lyell championed Hutton's vision of uniformitarianism, the principle that the present is the key to the past, that by studying processes operating now, we can understand how ancient landscapes were formed. I imagine Lyell traveling through Europe, notebook in hand, observing volcanic landscapes in Italy, studying the cliffs of Sicily, where marine fossils lay hundreds of feet above the current sea level, measuring the slow subsidence of temple columns at Pozzuoli, where ancient Roman pillars bore the marks of marine-boring organisms high above their bases, evidence that the land itself had sunk beneath the sea and risen again in historical time. And if such movements could occur in mere centuries, what might happen over millions of years? Lyell's work provided a comprehensive framework for understanding geological processes. He described how rivers build deltas through continuous deposition, how coral reefs grow upward as the seafloor beneath them slowly subsides, how volcanic activity builds mountains through countless small eruptions rather than single catastrophic events, and how erosion works grain by grain, storm by storm, to wear away even the highest peaks. But the question of time itself remained uncertain. Lyell and his contemporaries understood that the earth must be old, far older than the few thousand years allowed by literal biblical chronology, but exactly how old, that remained unknown. They could establish the sequence of events, could say this formation came before that one, but assigning actual ages in years lay beyond their methods. The early geologists developed a chronology based on fossils and rock types. They recognized that certain assemblages of organisms appeared in certain layers, and that by correlating these fossil assemblages across different locations, they could establish a relative time scale, the Cambrian period named for Wales, the Devonian for Devon, the Permian for the Perm region of Russia, each named for a place where rocks of that age were particularly well exposed or studied. I think about William Smith, an English canal engineer who, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, traveled extensively across Britain, supervising excavation projects, and noticed that the same sequence of rock layers appeared again and again, each characterized by distinctive fossils. He could predict what rocks would be encountered in a new excavation based on what he had seen elsewhere. And in 1815, he published the first geological map of England and Wales, a document of remarkable accuracy that showed the distribution of different rock formations across the landscape. This work of correlation and mapping, carried out by countless observers across Europe and beyond, gradually assembled a picture of Earth history, a sequence of periods and epochs, each characterized by different conditions, different climates, different assemblages of life, and though the absolute duration of these periods remained unknown, their order was becoming clear. The rocks revealed a progression. In the oldest layers, life was simple and marine, trilobites and brachiopods. Then came the age of fishes, then the great coal forests of the Carboniferous, laid down in vast swamps that would later be compressed into the black stone that powered the Industrial Revolution. Then the age of reptiles, with their enormous forms preserved in the Mesozoic strata, and finally the age of mammals, leading to the present. Each of these transitions was preserved in the rock record, and the more geologists studied, the more detail emerged in extinctions and radiations, climate changes recorded in the types of sediment, sea level changes marked by the advance and retreat of marine deposits across continental interiors, ice ages indicated by scratched bedrock and erratic boulders carried far from their sources, all of this written in stone, waiting to be read. And standing here, contemplating this early phase of geological understanding, I find myself marveling at the persistence of those early observers who looked at the world around them and refused to accept simple answers, who measured and mapped and correlated, who climbed mountains to examine their summits and descended into mines to study their depths, who collected fossils and minerals and rock samples, building collections that would become the foundation of natural history museums, and who gradually, through careful observation and logical inference, assembled a vision of Earth history that was both humbling and magnificent, a vision of time measured not in human generations, but in the rise and fall of mountain ranges, in the opening and closing of ocean basins, in the drift of continents across the face of the globe. The foundation was being laid, the principles established, and the great questions were coming into focus. How exactly did mountains form? What drove the cycles of sea level change? What was the Earth like in its earliest days? And most pressingly, how old was this ancient planet? How much time had elapsed since its formation? These questions would drive the next phase of geological investigation, would lead to new theories and new controversies, and would ultimately reveal a vision of the Earth more dynamic and more strange than those early pioneers could have imagined. The 19th century brought new tools and new questions, and among the most pressing was the age of the Earth itself. Lord Kelvin, a physicist of great renown, applied the laws of thermodynamics to the problem, calculating how long it would take for a molten Earth to cool to its present temperature. His mathematics were elegant, his reasoning seemingly sound, and his conclusion was troubling to geologists. The Earth, he declared, could be no more than 20 to 40 million years old, perhaps as few as 20 million. This estimate created a profound tension because geologists, looking at the rock record, at the immense thickness of sedimentary deposits, at the slow pace of erosion and deposition they could observe, felt certain that far more time was needed. The cycles they saw preserved in stone, the vast sequences of rising and falling seas, the building and erosion of mountain ranges, all of this seemed to demand hundreds of millions of years at minimum. And yet here was Kelvin, armed with the authority of physics, insisting that such time was not available. I imagine the frustration of those geologists, knowing what the rocks told them, yet unable to refute the mathematics. The debate simmered for decades, a fundamental disagreement about the very timeline of Earth history, and it would not be resolved until a discovery that no one anticipated, the discovery of radioactivity. In the closing years of the 1800s, Henri Becquerel noticed that uranium compounds emitted mysterious rays. Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium and polonium, and Ernest Rutherford began to understand that radioactive decay released energy. And here was the answer to Kelvin's dilemma. The Earth was not simply cooling from an initial molten state. It contained within itself a source of heat, the continuous decay of radioactive elements, generating warmth that had sustained geological processes far longer than Kelvin's calculations allowed. But radioactivity offered more than just a solution to the heat problem. It offered something geologists had sought for generations, a clock, because radioactive decay occurs at a constant, measurable rate, and because the parent element transforms into a specific daughter product. Measuring the ratio between them in a rock sample could reveal when that rock formed, when its minerals first crystallized, and the radioactive clock began ticking. Arthur Holmes, a young British geologist, pioneered the application of radiometric dating in the early 1900s, and the ages he obtained were staggering. Rocks more than 1 billion years old, more than 3 billion years old, and eventually samples from meteorites and the oldest Earth rocks, suggesting an age for the solar system of approximately 4.5 billion years. Time enough for all the slow processes written in the geological record, time enough for continents to drift, for oceans to open and close, for mountain ranges to rise and erode away completely, leaving only their deep roots exposed at the surface. This revelation of deep time transformed geology. But it was not the only transformation underway, because even as the question of age was being resolved, another mystery was demanding attention: the mystery of how mountains formed, and how to explain the obvious mobility of the Earth's crust. I think about standing in the Alps, where geologists in the late 1800s were mapping the structure of these great peaks, and discovering something extraordinary. Entire sequences of rock had been pushed horizontally for dozens of miles, older rocks thrust up and over younger ones, massive slabs of the Earth's crust stacked like shuffled cards. The forces required seemed almost inconceivable, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Mountains were not simply uplifted blocks. They were the products of compression, of crustal shortening, of immense horizontal forces that could fold and break and transport solid rock across vast distances. Similar observations came from other mountain ranges. The Appalachians, the Rockies, the Himalayas, all showed evidence of enormous crustal deformation, and geologists struggled to understand what could drive such movements. Theories proliferated. Perhaps the Earth was cooling and contracting, and mountains were wrinkles in a shrinking skin. Perhaps there were convection currents in the Earth's interior, rising heat pushing up beneath some regions and pulling down beneath others. The mechanisms remained unclear, but the evidence of crustal mobility was becoming overwhelming. And then there was Alfred Wegener, a meteorologist and explorer, who in 1912 proposed something radical, that the continents themselves moved, that they had once been joined together in a single supercontinent and had since drifted apart. He pointed to the matching coastlines of South America and Africa, like pieces of a torn newspaper that could be fitted back together. He noted similarities in rock types and ages on opposite sides of the Atlantic, identical fossil species found on continents now separated by thousands of miles of ocean, ancient glacial deposits in places now tropical, evidence of a different arrangement, a different geography. His theory of continental drift was met with skepticism, even hostility, because Wegener could not explain the mechanism. What force could move entire continents, plowing them through the solid rock of the ocean floor? Physicists calculated that no known force was adequate, and without a plausible mechanism, most geologists rejected the idea, dismissed it as speculative fantasy, despite the compelling pattern of evidence. I imagine Wegener, convinced of his theory, spending years gathering more evidence, correlating rock formations, studying paleoclimates, trying to demonstrate that the continents must have moved, and yet, unable to convince his colleagues, he died in 1930 on an expedition to Greenland, his theory largely rejected by the scientific establishment, and it would take 3 more decades before new evidence vindicated his vision. That evidence came from an unexpected source, the ocean floors. During and after the Second World War, new technologies developed for submarine warfare were turned to scientific purposes. Sonar mapping revealed the topography of the deep ocean, and what emerged was astonishing. Great mountain ranges running down the centers of ocean basins, the mid-ocean ridges, peaks rising thousands of feet above the abyssal plains, and deep trenches, enormous gouges in the ocean floor where the crust seemed to plunge down into the Earth's interior. Scientists began to study the magnetism of rocks on the ocean floor and discovered something remarkable. The rocks recorded the Earth's magnetic field at the time of their formation, and that field had flipped many times throughout history, north becoming south and south becoming north at irregular intervals, and on the ocean floor, These reversals were preserved in a symmetric pattern, stripes of normal and reversed magnetism running parallel to the mid-ocean ridges, identical on both sides, as if the seafloor was spreading, new crust forming at the ridges and moving outward in both directions, recording each magnetic reversal as it formed. Harry Hess, a geologist who had commanded a naval vessel during the war and used his ship's sonar to map the Pacific floor, proposed in the early 1960s that the ocean basins were indeed spreading, that new crust was being created at the ridges through volcanic activity, rising from the mantle below, and that old ocean crust was being consumed at the trenches, descending back into the Earth's interior. The seafloor was not permanent, but transient, recycling on timescales of hundreds of millions of years. This was the mechanism Wegener had lacked. If the seafloor could spread, then the continents riding on that seafloor would move with it, drifting apart or converging depending on the pattern of spreading and subduction, and suddenly all the evidence fell into place. The matching coastlines, the similar fossils, the ancient climates, all made sense if the continents had once been joined and had since separated. The theory crystallized rapidly in the mid-1960s. Plate tectonics, the understanding that the Earth's outer shell is divided into rigid plates, that these plates move relative to one another, driven by convection in the underlying mantle, that new crust forms at divergent boundaries like the mid-ocean ridges, that plates collide at convergent boundaries, building mountains or creating subduction zones where one plate descends beneath another, and that plates slide past one another at transform boundaries, creating earthquakes, but neither creating nor destroying crust. I think about the revolution this represented, a complete reconceptualization of how the Earth works. Suddenly geologists could explain not just continental drift, but earthquakes, volcanoes, mountain building, the distribution of mineral resources, the patterns of ancient climates, all within a single unifying framework. The Earth was not static but dynamic, its surface in constant motion, continents colliding and separating, ocean basins opening and closing, in a grand cycle that had repeated throughout Earth history. The evidence supporting plate tectonics accumulated rapidly. Precise measurements showed that the Atlantic Ocean was indeed widening, that Hawaii was moving northwestward over a stationary hotspot in the mantle, creating a chain of volcanic islands that grew progressively older away from the currently active volcanoes, that India had collided with Asia, crumpling the crust between them and raising the Himalayas, the highest mountains on Earth, still rising as the collision continued. Dating of seafloor rocks confirmed that the oldest ocean crust was less than 200 million years old, young compared to continental rocks that dated back billions of years, because ocean crust was continually created and destroyed, while continental crust, too buoyant to be subducted, accumulated over geological time, preserving a much longer record. And with this understanding came new insights into Earth history. Geologists could reconstruct ancient continental positions, could map how the supercontinent Pangaea had assembled from earlier fragments, how it had broken apart starting in the Mesozoic, how earlier supercontinents had existed before Pangaea, cycles of assembly and breakup, stretching back billions of years, each cycle taking hundreds of millions of years to complete. Continents drifting, colliding, welding together, then rifting apart again in a different configuration. The rock record took on new meaning. Sedimentary sequences that had seemed puzzling now made sense when the continents were restored to their ancient positions. Glacial deposits in Africa aligned with those in South America when the continents were joined. Coral reefs that had grown in tropical waters were found at high latitudes, evidence that the continents had migrated through different climate zones as they drifted across the globe. Mountain ranges revealed themselves as collision zones. The Appalachians formed when North America and Africa collided. The Urals, where Europe and Asia joined. The Alps, where Africa pushed northward into Europe. Each range a suture where ancient continents had welded together, and in some cases later rifted apart again, leaving fragments of one continent stranded on another, exotic terrains that told of complex histories of collision and dispersal. I find myself imagining the Earth from space, watching the slow dance of continents, seeing them drift and spin and collide over hundreds of millions of years, the ocean basins opening and closing like vast blue flowers, mountain ranges rising along collision zones and then slowly eroding away. And beneath it all, the steady churning of the mantle, heat rising from the deep interior, cooling nearer the surface, driving the circulation that powers plate motion, a great heat engine that has been running for billions of years, that will continue running for billions more. The recognition of plate tectonics as the fundamental organizing principle of geology opened new questions even as it answered old ones, because understanding that plates move is only the beginning. The deeper questions concern what drives that motion, what happens at different types of plate boundaries, how the Earth's interior is structured, and how geological processes at the surface connect to the vast heat engine operating in the depths below. I think about the structure of the Earth itself, revealed not through direct observation, for we cannot journey to the center, but through the study of seismic waves. Earthquakes generate waves that travel through the planet, and these waves behave differently as they pass through different materials. They speed up, slow down, refract, reflect, and by analyzing how earthquake waves arrive at seismometers around the world, geologists have constructed a picture of the Earth's interior, layer upon layer, each with distinct properties. The thin outer shell is the crust, only a few miles thick beneath the oceans, up to 40 or 50 miles thick beneath continents, composed of relatively light rocks, granites and basalts, floating on the denser material below. Beneath the crust lies the mantle, extending nearly 1,800 miles deep, composed of rock that is solid, but capable of flowing very slowly over geological time, like ice in a glacier, solid yet mobile. The mantle itself has structure, an upper mantle and a lower mantle, separated by a transition zone where minerals reorganize into denser crystal structures under the immense pressure, and at the center lies the core, divided into an outer core of liquid iron, generating the Earth's magnetic field through its motion, and an inner core of solid iron, crystallized under pressures millions of times greater than atmospheric pressure at the surface, a sphere of metal nearly as hot as the surface of the sun, yet solid because of the tremendous pressure squeezing it. This structure is not static. Heat flows outward from the core, generated partly by the residual warmth of the Earth's formation, partly by the decay of radioactive elements, And this heat drives convection in the mantle, hot rock rising slowly, cooling as it approaches the surface, then descending again in great Xunhuan currents that take millions of years to complete. And it is this convection, this slow churning of the solid mantle, that drives plate motion at the surface, at mid-ocean ridges. Hot mantle material rises, decompressing as it ascends, and beginning to melt. The molten rock, magma, rises into the gap between separating plates, crystallizing to form new ocean crust. And as this new crust forms, it pushes the older crust away on both sides like a conveyor belt, the seafloor spreading at rates of inches per year, slow by human standards, but fast enough to open ocean basins and separate continents over millions of years. At subduction zones, old cold ocean crust, dense and heavy, descends back into the mantle, pulling the rest of the plate with it. This sinking slab is perhaps the most important driver of plate motion. The cold material is denser than the surrounding hot mantle, and gravity pulls it downward, dragging the surface plate along. The descending slab generates earthquakes as it bends and breaks, and these earthquakes, occurring at progressively greater depths along the descending plate, trace its path down into the mantle. I imagine standing near a subduction zone, perhaps along the coast of South America or Japan, where the ocean floor is being consumed. The descending plate carries water, locked in minerals and sediments, down into the hot mantle, and as it descends and heats, that water is released, lowering the melting point of the surrounding rock, causing it to melt, and the resulting magma, lighter than the solid rock around it, rises toward the surface, sometimes erupting explosively to form the great volcanic arcs that parallel subduction zones, the Andes, the Cascades, the islands of Japan and Indonesia, all born from this process of subduction and melting at convergent boundaries where continents collide. Neither plate can be subducted because continental crust is too light, too buoyant. Instead, the crust crumples and thickens, folding and faulting, thrusting great sheets of rock over one another, building mountain ranges whose roots extend deep into the mantle, and the process generates heat through friction and compression, sometimes melting rock deep below, creating granite plutons that slowly cool and crystallize. And millions of years later, after erosion has stripped away the overlying rock, these plutons are exposed at the surface, the hearts of ancient mountains revealed. The timescales involved are almost beyond comprehension. The Atlantic Ocean has been opening for approximately 200 million years, spreading at about an inch per year, creating the ocean basin that now separates the Americas from Europe and Africa. The Himalayas have been rising for roughly 50 million years and will continue rising until India's northward motion eventually ceases. The Appalachians were built during a collision between 400 and 300 million years ago, once as high as the Himalayas, now worn down to gentle forested ridges, their ancient roots exposed, giving us a glimpse of what the Himalayas will look like hundreds of millions of years hence. And the rock cycle itself became clearer in this framework, igneous rocks crystallizing from molten magma, either deep below the surface as intrusive rocks like granite, or erupting at the surface as extrusive rocks like basalt, these rocks weathering and eroding, breaking down into sediment that is transported by wind and water, accumulating in layers, compacting and cementing into sedimentary rocks, sandstone and shale and limestone. These rocks buried and subjected to heat and pressure, transforming into metamorphic rocks, schist and gneiss and marble, their minerals reorganizing into new forms, stable at higher temperatures and pressures, and sometimes, if the temperature rises high enough, melting back into magma, completing the cycle, rock transforming endlessly from one form to another, cycling through the Earth's crust and upper mantle over hundreds of millions of years. I think about how this understanding transformed geology from a descriptive science into a predictive one. Geologists could now explain where to look for certain types of mineral deposits, where earthquakes were likely to occur, where volcanic eruptions might threaten populated areas. They could reconstruct ancient environments, understanding that coal deposits formed in tropical swamps, that thick sequences of limestone indicated warm, shallow seas, that glacial deposits marked periods of global cooling. The study of past climates, paleoclimatology, flourished as geologists learned to read the signals preserved in rocks, isotopes of oxygen in ancient shells recording ocean temperatures, types of pollen in lake sediments revealing what plants grew in the surrounding landscape, glacial deposits and dropstones indicating ice ages, coral reefs showing sea level positions, all of this data allowing reconstruction of how climate had changed through Earth history. The warm greenhouse periods when ice was absent even at the poles, the icehouse periods when glaciers advanced and sea levels dropped, the transitions between these states, and the search for what drove these changes in the Earth's orbit, subtle variations in the tilt of its axis and the shape of its orbit around the Sun, these Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian scientist who calculated them, influenced how much sunlight reached different parts of the Earth at different seasons, driving the advance and retreat of ice sheets over cycles of tens of thousands of years. The ice ages of the recent geological past, the Pleistocene, when great ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, advancing and retreating in rhythm with these orbital variations. But longer-term climate changes required other explanations. The configuration of continents influenced ocean currents and atmospheric circulation. When continents clustered near the poles, ice could accumulate. When they gathered near the equator, the climate warmed. The uplift of mountain ranges altered wind patterns. The weathering of newly exposed rock consumed atmospheric carbon dioxide, potentially triggering cooling. Volcanic eruptions released carbon dioxide and other gases, potentially triggering warming, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere itself, regulated by the balance between volcanic outgassing and the weathering of silicate rocks, emerged as a crucial control on global temperature over millions of years. And then there were the mass extinctions, periods when large fractions of species disappeared from the fossil record in geologically brief intervals. The end Permian extinction 252 million years ago, the most severe, eliminating perhaps 90% of marine species. The end Cretaceous extinction 66 million years ago, famous for the demise of the dinosaurs. Each of these events preserved in the rock record as a boundary where diverse fossil assemblages gave way to impoverished ones, where the old world ended and a new one began. The causes of these extinctions became subjects of intense investigation. Some appeared linked to massive volcanic eruptions, the Siberian traps at the end of the Permian, the Deccan traps near the end of the Cretaceous. Vast outpourings of lava that released enormous quantities of gases, potentially triggering climate change and ocean acidification severe enough to cause global ecosystem collapse, but for the end. Cretaceous event, evidence emerged of something else, a layer of sediment enriched in iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in meteorites, found at exactly the extinction boundary all around the world. The impact hypothesis, proposed in 1980 by Luis and Walter Alvarez and their colleagues, suggested that an asteroid or comet had struck the Earth, throwing up debris that darkened the skies, blocking sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet and photosynthesis to cease. And eventually the impact crater was found, buried beneath sediments on the Yucatan Peninsula, Chicxulub, a scar more than 100 miles across, formed by an object perhaps 6 miles in diameter, striking the Earth with unimaginable force, and the timing matched perfectly, 66 million years ago, exactly when the dinosaurs and countless other species disappeared from the fossil record. Geology had become capable of reading not just the slow processes of mountain building and erosion, but catastrophes, brief violent events whose effects rippled through the Earth system. And this recognition brought a new humility, an understanding that the Earth's history included not just gradual change, but sudden transformations, that the story written in stone contained chapters of calm accumulation interrupted by pages of chaos, and that our own existence on this planet occurred within a particular moment, a particular configuration of continents and climate that would not last forever, that was itself part of an ongoing transformation. I find myself standing again at that cliff edge, the light fading now toward evening, and I look out across the layered landscape with a different understanding, seeing not just the static bands of color, but the processes they represent, the ancient seas rising and falling, the mountains building and eroding, the climates shifting from tropical to glacial and back, the continents drifting across the globe, colliding and fragmenting, and through it all, life adapting and evolving, sometimes flourishing in great radiations, sometimes nearly extinguished in mass die-offs, but persisting, transforming, leaving its traces in the fossil record that helps us date and correlate the rocks themselves. And I feel myself becoming very quiet, my thoughts slowing further, as I prepare to consider what all of this means, what it tells us about the nature of time and change and the deep patterns that govern our world. Standing here in the deepening twilight, I find myself thinking about what geology truly teaches us, beyond the mechanisms and the time scales, beyond the vocabulary of faults and folds and unconformities. There is something profound in the science, something that touches on the nature of knowledge itself and our place within the vast unfolding of time. Geology is fundamentally a historical science, unlike physics or chemistry, which can conduct controlled experiments, repeating conditions to test predictions. Geologists must work backward from evidence, must read the fragmentary record preserved in stone and infer what happened. They are detectives examining a crime scene billions of years old, where most of the evidence has been destroyed or altered, where the witnesses are all gone, and yet from the clues that remain, they reconstruct events with remarkable precision. There is something beautiful in this act of reconstruction, in the way a geologist can look at an outcrop of folded rock and see not just the present configuration, but the forces that created it can visualize the horizontal layers being compressed, shortening, buckling upward into anticlines and downward into synclines, can estimate the temperature and pressure conditions, can place this deformation in sequence with other events, and can connect it to plate motions happening hundreds or thousands of miles away. I think about how geology teaches patience because the processes it studies operate on timescales so far beyond human experience. A mountain range takes tens of millions of years to build and tens of millions more to erode away. The opening of an ocean basin, the journey of a continent from one hemisphere to another, these are transformations that unfold over hundreds of millions of years. And yet they are real. They are happening. The earth beneath our feet is moving right now, rising here, subsiding there, the mountains growing imperceptibly taller with each earthquake, the canyons cutting infinitesimally deeper with each flood. And there is something deeply calming in this perspective, in recognizing that our human concerns, our brief lives, our temporary structures, all exist within a larger context of ongoing planetary transformation. The solid ground we think of as permanent and unchanging is neither. It is part of a dynamic system engaged in processes that began long before humans existed and will continue long after we are gone. And this recognition does not diminish us, but places us, gives us context, shows us our moment within the immense sweep of geological time. The Earth's history stretches back 4.5 billion years. If we compressed this into a single day, humans would appear only in the final few seconds before midnight. All of recorded history would fit into the last tenth of a second. And yet those 4.5 billion years are written in the rocks around us, waiting to be read, each grain of sand a fragment of an older rock, each pebble in a stream a traveler from some distant source, each cliff face a library containing volumes of information about ancient environments and processes. I find myself thinking about what geology reveals about change itself, about how transformation happens through the accumulation of small increments over vast time. A river does not carve a canyon through sudden catastrophe, though floods may accelerate the process, but through the patient removal of sediment, grain by grain, day after day, year after year, until eventually a deep gorge has been excavated. Mountains do not leap fully formed from the earth, but rise through countless small uplifts, each earthquake adding a few feet, each volcanic eruption building the edifice higher, until over millions of years peaks pierce the clouds. And yet geology also shows us that catastrophes matter, that rare events can reshape the world. An asteroid impact, a massive volcanic eruption, these brief moments of chaos that leave their marks in the rock record, remind us that history is not simply smooth, gradual change, but includes disruptions, transitions, moments when the old order collapses and something new emerges. And both patterns are true, both the slow accumulation and the sudden transformation, both the patient wearing away and the violent rupture. There is a kind of wisdom in understanding these rhythms, in recognizing that change operates on many timescales, that what seems permanent may be temporary when viewed across millions of years, and what seems catastrophic may be part of a larger pattern of variation. The ice ages that seemed so dramatic were just the most recent expression of climate variability that has characterized Earth history. periods of warmth and cold, high and low sea level, oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor oceans, cycling through different states, the Earth system exploring different configurations while remaining within the bounds that allow life to persist. And thinking about deep time, about the billions of years of Earth history, I feel a strange sense of connection, because the atoms in my body were forged in stars, were present when the Earth formed, have cycled through rocks and oceans and atmosphere, have been part of mountains and rivers, plants and animals. The calcium in my bones was perhaps once part of a coral reef in an ancient sea. The iron in my blood was perhaps once locked in a magnetite crystal in a cooling lava flow. We are not separate from the earth, but part of it, temporary assemblages of matter that will eventually return to the great cycles, our atoms dispersing to become part of other rocks, other living things in the ongoing transformation. Geology teaches humility, shows us that the earth does not need us, that it existed for billions of years before we appeared and will continue for billions more after we are gone, that the processes shaping it are vast and powerful, beyond our ability to control. And yet it also shows us that we have become a geological force, that human activity is now shaping the Earth's surface, altering its atmosphere and oceans, influencing which species survive and which disappear. We are living in the Anthropocene, the age of humans, a geological epoch defined by our impact. And this recognition brings responsibility, the understanding that our actions have consequences that will persist in the rock record, that will be readable by whatever intelligences study the earth millions of years hence. I watch the last light fading from the sky, the cliff face before me dissolving into shadow, the layers becoming less distinct as darkness gathers. And I find my thoughts becoming quieter still, settling into a contemplative stillness that matches the ancient patience of the stones. There is something restful in geology, in its long view, its acceptance of change as fundamental, its recognition that everything is temporary and everything is part of larger patterns. The mountains will erode, the seas will drain or deepen, the continents will drift to new positions, life will continue evolving, adapting to new conditions, and through it all, the earth will remain, transforming, cycling, expressing the laws of physics and chemistry through an endless variety of forms. And standing here, in this liminal moment between day and night, I feel myself letting go of the need to hold too tightly to any particular configuration, any particular arrangement of land and sea and sky, because geology teaches that everything flows, everything changes, even the apparently solid ground beneath our feet. And there is peace in accepting this, in allowing things to be what they are, knowing they will become something else, trusting the processes that have been operating for billions of years. The stars are beginning to appear above, light from distant suns, some of which may no longer exist, the light traveling across space for years or centuries or millennia to reach my eyes. And I think about how we are always looking backward in time, even in our immediate perception. Light takes time to travel. And in geology, this is profoundly true. We are always studying the past, reading the evidence of what was, and from this past we construct our understanding of how the earth works. We identify the principles, test them against new observations, refine our theories, building a more complete picture of this dynamic planet we inhabit. The air grows cooler, carrying the mineral scent of stone, and I breathe slowly, feeling the rise and fall of my chest, the air entering my lungs, oxygen molecules that have cycled through the atmosphere countless times, breathed by other organisms, dissolved in ancient oceans, released by photosynthesizing plants, part of the great chemical cycles that connect living things to the rocks and waters and air around them. Everything connected, everything part of the vast Earth system. My eyes rest on the darkened cliff, where I know the layers continue, though I can no longer see them clearly. Each band representing a chapter in Earth history, each contact between different rock types, marking a change in conditions and a shift in sea level, a change in sediment source. And I let these images settle in my mind, not trying to analyze or categorize, just allowing the sense of deep time to wash over me, the recognition of how much has happened, how much transformation has occurred in this place where I stand. And I think about how tomorrow the sun will rise again. Light will return to reveal these same rocks, these same layers, looking unchanged from today, because the processes of geology operate so slowly that we cannot perceive their motion in a single human lifetime, and yet they are moving, changing. The cliff is imperceptibly eroding, grains loosening and falling. The continent beneath me is drifting, rising, or subsiding by minute amounts. The Earth turning on its axis, orbiting the sun, part of a solar system orbiting the center of the galaxy. All of it in motion, all of it transformation. The quietness deepens, my breathing slows further, and I find I have nothing more I need to understand, nothing more I need to figure out. The rocks will keep their secrets and reveal them in time. The earth will continue its processes whether I comprehend them fully or not. And there is freedom in this, in not needing to grasp everything, in accepting that some knowledge unfolds slowly, that understanding deepens gradually, like sediment accumulating, grain by grain, layer upon layer. And as the darkness becomes complete, as the last traces of twilight fade from the western sky, I feel myself settling into a profound stillness, a quietness that extends beyond my own mind, that seems to emanate from the ancient stones themselves, the patient, enduring presence of rock that has witnessed so much, that has been shaped by forces beyond imagining, and has emerged into the present moment, solid, real, grounding me in this place, in this time, even as it reminds me of the vastness of all the time that has passed and all the time yet to come. And in this recognition, this acceptance of the immensity of geological time, I find myself becoming very still, very quiet, letting the silence deepen, letting the darkness gather, as the earth continues its slow, eternal turning, and all things flow and change and remain. There is a kind of quiet that comes only with evening, when the world slows and the noise of the day fades. And in that gentle hush, thoughts turn to things older than ourselves, to voices that have traveled across centuries, carried on the wings of carefully chosen words. Tonight the mind wanders toward poetry, toward those rare souls who shaped language into something luminous, who found music in syllables and truth in metaphor, and who left behind words that still echo in the corridors of human memory. Imagine a vast garden stretching across time itself, where each path leads to a different voice, a different vision, and each flowering plant represents a poet whose work has endured, has been whispered and sung and remembered, passed from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms. The air here feels thick with possibility, with the weight of expression, and there is something almost sacred about the space, as if the very atmosphere remembers every line ever written, every verse ever spoken aloud in the darkness, every moment when language transcended its ordinary function and became something more. In this imagined garden, the light is always soft, golden and forgiving, the kind of light that painters dream of capturing, and the shadows are long and gentle, creating spaces where contemplation feels natural, where the mind can wander without urgency or destination. The poets themselves seem to walk here too, not as they were in life, weary and complicated and bound by circumstance, but as they exist in their work, distilled into essence, into the purest expression of what they saw and felt and understood about being human. There is Homer, standing at the very edge of the garden, where it meets the wild unknown. His blind eyes turn toward something beyond sight, and his voice rises like the sea, rhythmic and powerful, speaking of the heroes and journeys and the long road home, speaking in verses that were memorized and repeated for generations before anyone thought to write them down. And there, in a corner where marble columns catch the light, is Sappho, fragments of her work scattered like petals, beautiful even in their incompleteness, speaking of desire and longing with an intensity that makes the air shimmer. Her words so vivid that 25 centuries cannot dim them. The garden paths wind and intersect, leading through different landscapes, different climates of thought and feeling, and each turn reveals another presence, another voice that shaped the way humanity speaks to itself. Here is a grove of Persian roses, and among them walks Rumi, his robes moving like water, speaking of love that dissolves boundaries, of whirling dances and divine intoxication, his words creating bridges between the earthly and the eternal, between the human heart and something vast and unknowable. The Japanese maple trees glow red and gold, and beneath their branches sits Basho, watching a frog leap into an old pond, capturing that single moment in 17 syllables, teaching the world that poetry can live in the smallest observation, that infinity can be glimpsed in a dewdrop. There are voices in English, too, weaving through the garden like familiar melodies. Shakespeare, whose sonnets explore love and time and mortality with such precision that they feel like mathematical proofs written in music, each word chosen with surgical care, each image layered with meaning. And Milton, his voice rolling like thunder across paradise lost and found, grappling with cosmic questions in verse so dense and rich it demands to be read slowly, savored like something aged and complex. The romantics gather near a wild stream, where nature grows untamed and passionate. Wordsworth, wandering lonely as a cloud, Keats standing before his Grecian urn, speaking to nightingales in autumn, finding in the natural world a mirror for human emotion, teaching that poetry could capture ecstasy, could preserve beauty in amber-like perfection. And there, in a darker corner where the shadows deepen, is Emily Dickinson, keeper of small truths, observer of death and immortality from her window in Amherst, writing poems that seem simple until you look closer, until you realize how much weight she carried in her dashes and her slant rhymes. The garden continued, Krusten, spreading in all directions, encompassing continents and centuries. And the remarkable thing is how these voices speak to each other, how they answer and challenge and build upon what came before, creating a conversation that spans all of human history. This is where the journey begins, in this imagined space where poetry lives, where the greatest practitioners of the art still walk and speak, where their words hang in the air like visible breath on a cold morning, beautiful and temporary and essential. And to understand this garden, to know these voices, is to understand something fundamental about what it means to be human, to feel and think and struggle, to express the inexpressible through the ancient and ever-new medium of verse. The garden begins where language itself begins, in the firelight of ancient gatherings, where story and song were not yet separated, where the first poets were also priests and historians and keepers of collective memory. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, recording the epic of Gilgamesh, a story so old it predates the alphabet, telling of a king who sought immortality and found instead the bitter sweetness of human limitation. And though we don't know the name of the poet who first shaped these tales, their voice survives, speaking across an almost incomprehensible distance. The verse moved in patterns, repeating phrases like waves returning to shore, making the epic easier to remember in a world where memory was the only library. And already, even at this earliest moment, poetry was doing what it would always do, taking the chaos of human experience and giving it shape, giving it rhythms, making it something that could be carried forward. In the Mediterranean world, poetry emerged from the sea itself, from the salt, bright Aegean where Homer stood, blind or perhaps never singular, perhaps a tradition rather than a man, singing the Iliad and the Odyssey in dactylic hexameter, that rolling 6-beat line that mimics the sound of oars in water, the march of soldiers, the inevitable progression of fate. These epics were not written at first, they were performed, and the poet was a kind of musician, using formulaic phrases like building blocks, rosy-fingered dawn, and wine-dark sea, and swift-footed Achilles, epithets that served as both description and mnemonic device, helping the singer remember the thousands of lines that made up the tale, and what tales they were, full of rage and pride and the terrible beauty of warfare, full of cunning, Odysseus finding his way home through monsters and enchantments, teaching the Greeks what it meant to be Greek, what values to cherish, what warnings to heed. By the 7th century before the Common Era, poetry had found a new voice in Sappho, writing on the island of Lesbos, and here something shifted. The epic scope narrowed to the intensity of personal feeling, to desire and jealousy and the ache of beauty. She wrote in the lyric meters meant to be sung to the lyre, and though only fragments of her 9 books survive, those fragments burn with an immediacy that feels utterly modern. She wrote of a girl whose laughter made her heart race, of apple blossoms and the moon and stars, of wedding songs and hymns to Aphrodite. And in doing so, she established that poetry could be intimate, could speak from the personal rather than the cosmic, could make private emotion into something universal. The Greeks understood poetry as techne, as craft, something that could be studied and refined. And by the 5th century, in Athens, dramatic poetry had evolved, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides writing verse for actors to speak on stage, exploring fate and free will through the mouths of mythological characters, making poetry a public art, a civic responsibility. Meanwhile, in the East, other traditions were flowering. In China during the Zhou dynasty, the Shijing, or classic of poetry, collected 305 songs, folk ballads, and aristocratic odes and ritual hymns, preserving voices from the 11th to the 7th centuries before the Common Era, voices singing of love and war and the turning seasons, of soldiers longing for home and women waiting by rivers. Confucius himself would later emphasize the study of these poems, believing they could cultivate moral character and social harmony, that the right words in the right order could shape a person's inner life, could teach empathy and righteousness. And so poetry became embedded in Chinese education, in the examination system that would persist for millennia. In India, the great Sanskrit epics were taking shape. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, vast poem cycles that contained within them entire worlds, philosophies and genealogies and moral dilemmas. Valmiki composing the Ramayana in elegant shlokas, couplets that balanced perfectly, creating a rhythm that could carry a listener through tens of thousands of verses. And beyond the epics, the Vedic hymns, even older, poems of praise to gods of fire and sky and soma, composed by rishis who claimed to see the cosmic order, who used language as a form of magic, believing that the right words spoken with the right intention could shape reality itself. The Romans inherited Greek forms and transformed them. Virgil writing the Aeneid in conscious homage to Homer, but with a Roman purpose, celebrating Augustus and the founding of empire, taking 12 years to write 12 books, polishing each line until it gleamed, creating what would become the model for epic poetry in Europe for the next 1,500 years. And there was Ovid, playful and erotic and brilliant, writing the Metamorphose, a collection of transformation myths that flowed like quicksilver from one story to the next, everything changing, everything in flux, gods becoming animals, becoming stars, becoming trees, teaching that the only constant in existence is change itself. Horace wrote odes that explored friendship and mortality and the pleasures of a modest life, his voice intimate and philosophical, setting a template for lyric poetry that would echo through the centuries, the personal meditation, the turning over of experience to find meaning in it. As Rome fell, poetry became the property of monasteries, of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving Virgil and Ovid while the empire crumbled outside their walls. And for centuries in Europe, poetry meant Latin poetry, meant classical forms and Christian themes, meant hymns and liturgy and saints' lives rendered in verse. But other poetries were flourishing elsewhere. In Persia, where Ferdowsi spent 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic of 50,000 couplets, preserving pre-Islamic Iranian history and mythology, creating a national identity through verse, keeping the Persian language alive when Arabic threatened to replace it. And there was Omar Khayyam, mathematician and astronomer and poet, writing quatrains that pondered fate and pleasure and the mystery of existence, though whether he wrote all the verses attributed to him remains uncertain. His voice, or the voice using his name, spoke of wine and roses and the fleeting nature of life with a melancholy wisdom that would later enchant the Victorian world. In the Arab world, poetry was the supreme art. Pre-Islamic Arabia celebrated its poets as cultural heroes, and the mu'allaqat, the suspended poems, were said to have been written in gold and hung in Mecca. 7 odes of such beauty that they became touchstones, establishing meters and themes that would define Arabic verse. The qasida structure moving from nostalgic remembrance to journey to praise. The arrival of Islam brought new purposes to poetry. The Quran itself was considered inimitable, beyond poetry, but shaping all Arabic that came after. And Sufi mystics would use poetry as a vehicle for divine love, for expressing states of ecstasy and union with God, creating a tradition where the beloved addressed in the poem might be human or might be the divine, or both at once. In Japan, the Man-yoshu, or collection of 10,000 leaves, gathered poems from the 7th and 8th centuries. Voices high and low, emperors and peasants and soldiers on the frontier, writing in waka form, 31 syllables arranged in lines of 5-7, 5-7-7, capturing moments of beauty and sorrow with extraordinary compression. This Japanese aesthetic valued suggestion over statement, the importance of what was left unsaid, mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, and poetry became the medium best suited to capturing this, to pointing toward what cannot be directly expressed. By the medieval period in Europe, new forms were emerging, the troubadours of Provence writing in Occitan love songs of courtly devotion, often addressed to unattainable noble ladies, creating an entire vocabulary of longing and service, influencing Dante and Petrarch and the entire trajectory of European love poetry. Dante himself, writing in Italian rather than Latin, made the vernacular respectable for serious poetry. His Divine Comedy, taking the reader through hell and purgatory and paradise, using terza rima, interlocking 3-line stanzas that move forward with inexorable logic, each rhyme pulling the next line along, creating a sense of journey and inevitability. And here was one of poetry's great powers becoming clear: the ability to make systems of belief visible, to give metaphysical concepts concrete images, to let readers walk through the architecture of heaven and hell, to make abstract theology into lived experience through the specificity of verse. Petrarch followed, perfecting the sonnet, that 14-line form that would become perhaps the most influential in Western poetry, writing 366 poems to Laura, exploring love and desire and the passage of time with such psychological nuance that he created a template for introspection, showing how a fixed form could contain infinite variation. In Persia, Hafez was writing ghazals in Shiraz, poems of love and wine and mystical longing, playing with ambiguity, with multiple levels of meaning, his collected works becoming a form of divination. The divan opened at random to seek guidance, his verse so melodious in Persian that it set the standard for what poetry should sound like. And Rumi, writing in the 13th century, producing thousands of verses, his Ma'navi, or spiritual couplets, running to 25,000 lines, teaching through stories and parables, using poetry as a path to truth, to the annihilation of self in divine love, his voice ecstatic and wise, and still speaking across 8 centuries to readers worldwide. The tradition was building layer upon layer, each poet learning from predecessors, sometimes in reverence, sometimes in rebellion, but always in conversation, always adding to the great accumulation of human expression that poetry represented. By the time the Renaissance flowered in Europe, poetry had become inseparable from learning itself, from what it meant to be educated, to be civilized, and the rediscovery of classical texts brought new energy to verse, new models to emulate and transform. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer had already shown what could be done in the vernacular, writing the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, giving each pilgrim a distinct voice, a distinct way of seeing the world, creating characters so vivid they seemed to breathe, and doing it all in rhyme couplets that moved with conversational ease despite their formal structure. The iambic pentameter he helped establish, that 10-syllable line with its da, dum, da, dum, da, dum, da, dum, da, dum rhythm, would become the backbone of English poetry, the line that somehow matched the natural rhythms of English speech while elevating it, making it musical. Then came the 16th century, and with it a cascade of poetic innovation. Sir Thomas Wyatt, bringing the Italian sonnet to England, adapting it, making it speak in English accents, and the Earl of Surrey developing what would become the Shakespearean sonnet form, 3 quatrains and a couplet, a structure perfectly suited to argument and reversal, to building tension and then releasing it in those final 2 lines. Edmund Spenser created his own unique stanza, 9 lines rhyming A, B, B, C, B, C, C, an intricate interlocking pattern he used to construct the Faerie Queene, that vast allegorical romance celebrating Elizabeth and Protestant virtue, showing that poetry could build entire worlds, complete mythologies, sustained across thousands of lines. And then there was Shakespeare, who took the sonnet and made it do some things no one had imagined possible. 154 poems exploring love and time and beauty and mortality with such depth that each one feels like a complete philosophical inquiry compressed into 14 lines. The metaphors startling and precise, the arguments turning on themselves, revealing new facets with each reading. But Shakespeare's dramatic verse might be even more revolutionary, writing plays almost entirely in poetry, in blank verse that could encompass everything from Hamlet's tortured introspection to the earthy jokes of gravediggers, proving that poetry was not just for elevated subjects, that it could contain the full range of human experience, high and low, comic and tragic, all rendered in language that felt both natural and heightened. His contemporaries were no less ambitious. Christopher Marlowe, with his mighty line, Ben Jonson, with his classical precision, John Donne transforming religious devotion and erotic love into metaphysical conceits. Comparisons so elaborate and unexpected they seemed to bend reality, comparing lovers to compasses, death to a short sleep, making the abstract concrete through sheer inventiveness. Donne's holy sonnets wrestled with God, demanding, bargaining, confessing, bringing an almost violent intensity to religious verse. Batter my heart, 3-personed God, he wrote, wanting to be broken open, overwhelmed, showing that poetry could be a place of genuine spiritual struggle, not just pious sentiment, in the same period across Europe. Other poets were reaching similar heights. Luis de Góngora, in Spain, creating a Baroque style so ornate and complex it required scholarly annotation, his soledades pushing language to its limits, making syntax twist and fold back on itself, proving that difficulty itself could be a poetic virtue, that poetry didn't have to be immediately accessible to be profound, And there was John Milton, perhaps the last great poet who believed he could explain the ways of God to humankind, spending years preparing to write Paradise Lost, learning languages, studying theology and philosophy, and then, when blindness came, dictating the epic to daughters and assistants, creating blank verse of such muscular complexity that it seemed to contain the weight of all Western learning. His Satan became the most compelling character in the poem, almost against the poet's intention, speaking with such pride and defiance that Romantic poets 2 centuries later would see him as a hero. And perhaps this revealed something about poetry's independence from the poet's conscious purpose, the way a character in verse could take on life, could mean things the author never intended. The 17th century also saw the rise of devotional poetry in English. George Herbert creating pattern poems, shaped like altars and angel wings on the page, exploring Christian faith with a tenderness and humility that balanced Dawn's intensity, showing that simplicity could be as powerful as complexity, that the plain style had its own music. In Japan, Matsuo Basho was transforming haiku from a kind of parlor game into a serious art, traveling through remote provinces with only a pack and a notebook, writing verses that captured the essence of a moment, the old pond and the frog's splash, the silence that follows, teaching that 17 syllables could contain infinity, that poetry didn't need length to have depth. His travel diaries combined prose and verse, creating a new form, the haibun, where poems emerged from narrative like jewels from their settings, and his influence would spread throughout Japan, creating schools and styles that persist to this day. The idea that attention itself, deep noticing, was a form of spiritual practice, and poetry the record of that attention. By the 18th century, poetry in English had achieved a kind of formal perfection. Alexander Pope writing heroic couplets so polished they seemed inevitable. An essay on criticism and the rape of the lock, showing that wit and moral philosophy could be rendered in verse of crystalline clarity, every line balanced, every caesura placed with precision. But this perfection contained the seeds of rebellion. The next generation would react against such control, such artifice. And the Romantic Revolution would explode across Europe like a spring storm after a long winter. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge published Lyrical Ballads in 1798, a collection that announced a new aesthetic. Poetry should use the language really spoken by people, should take as its subjects common life, the rural poor, everyday experiences transfigured by imagination. Wordsworth wrote of daffodils and shepherd boys and a solitary reaper, finding in nature not just pretty scenery, but a living force, a source of spiritual renewal. His autobiographical poem, The Prelude, tracking the growth of a poet's mind across 14 books, showing how childhood experiences in the Lake District shaped his entire vision of the world. Coleridge dreamed the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, a ballad of supernatural terror and redemption, proving that the old forms could still carry new meanings, could be vehicles for psychological exploration. The mariner doomed to repeat his tale, trapped in his guilt, a figure of the modern consciousness, burdened by knowledge it cannot escape. John Keats, dead at 25, left behind odes that seemed to distill beauty into its purest form. Ode to a Grecian urn, ode to a nightingale, ode on melancholy, each one a meditation on art and mortality, on the relationship between the eternal and the fleeting. His language so rich and sensuous you could almost taste it, seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Every word chosen for sound as much as sense. Lord Byron created a persona, the Byronic hero, dark and brooding and irresistible, and wrote verse tales that made him the first literary celebrity. Read across Europe, translated immediately, influencing everyone from Pushkin to Lermontov, showing that poetry could create a public figure, could make the poet himself into a kind of artwork. Percy Bysshe Shelley believed poetry could change the world, could legislate for humanity even if unacknowledged. His defense of poetry arguing that imagination was the root of all moral good, and his own verse ranged from the political anger of the Mask of Anarchy to the sublime abstraction of Mont Blanc, trying always to push language toward the ineffable, toward what could barely be expressed. And there was William Blake, engraving his own illuminated books, combining word and image, creating a private mythology of Los and Urizen and the four Zoas, seeing visions from childhood, claiming to converse with angels, his songs of innocence and experience contrasting two states of the human soul, the lamb and the tiger, the chimney sweeper enslaved and the child on a cloud, showing that poetry could be prophetic, visionary, utterly unique. In America, poetry was finding its own voice. Walt Whitman publishing Leaves of Grass in 1855, a book he would revise and expand for the rest of his life, writing in long free verse lines that broke completely from European models, celebrating democracy and the body and the open road, containing multitudes, contradicting himself, giving America an epic that matched its sprawling landscape and democratic ideals. His contemporary Emily Dickinson worked in the opposite direction, writing in tiny hymn meters, short lines with slant rhymes, almost 1,800 poems found after her death, most unpublished during her lifetime, exploring consciousness and death and immortality with such compression that each poem felt like a metaphysical riddle, a trapdoor opening onto infinity. In France, Charles Baudelaire was transforming poetry with Les Fleurs du Mal, finding beauty in decay, in the urban landscape of Paris, in prostitutes and rag pickers, and the detritus of modern life, creating symbolism, the idea that objects and images could resonate with meanings beyond their literal selves, that poetry could evoke rather than describe, could work through suggestion and association. Arthur Rimbaud, still a teenager, pushed this further, writing A Season in Hell and Illuminations, prose poems that shattered syntax and logic, pursuing a systematic derangement of the senses, trying to make himself a seer through the destruction of ordinary perception, and then abandoning poetry entirely at 20, walking away to become a trader in Africa, leaving behind work that would influence surrealism and modernism. Decades later, the Russian tradition produced its own giants, Alexander Pushkin creating modern Russian literary language through his verse novel Eugene Onegin, writing in a 14-line stanza, form so flexible it could contain lyric beauty and satirical wit and narrative drive all at once, his influence so profound that Russian poetry is still measured against him. And the symbolist movement spread. Stéphane Mallarmé, writing poems of such musical abstraction, they seemed to approach pure sound, pure idea, believing that poetry should evoke mystery, should work through absence and suggestion, his un coup de dice, a throw of the dice, scattering words across the page in patterns that made typography part of the poem's meaning. The 20th century arrived like a storm, and poetry fractured into 1,000 new directions, each poet seeking a way to speak in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable, where technology and war and psychological discovery had shattered old certainties. Thomas Hardy was still writing in England, his poetry emerging late in life after decades as a novelist, verse marked by loss and regret and a kind of austere honesty about suffering, looking back at the Victorian age from a new century that had no use for Victorian optimism. But the real break came with modernism, with Ezra Pound demanding poets make it new, stripping away Victorian ornament and sentiment, looking back to classical Chinese poetry and medieval Provençal verse for models of compression and precision, imagism, the idea that a poem could present an image so exact that it needed no explanation. In a station of the metro, petals on a wet black bough, 14 words containing an entire aesthetic philosophy. T.S. Eliot published The Waste Land in 1922, a poem that seemed to mirror the fragmentation of post-war Europe, shifting between voices and languages and time periods. Quoting Sanskrit and Shakespeare and music hall songs, creating a collage that required footnotes to decode, showing that poetry could be difficult, could demand work from its readers, and still be essential. The poem opened with April as the cruelest month, reversing Chaucer, suggesting that rebirth was painful, perhaps impossible, and moved through a landscape of spiritual drought, broken images, a heap of broken mirrors, asking what could sustain meaning in a world where the old certainties had died in the trenches of the Great War. William Butler Yeats was pursuing his own transformation, moving from the dreamy Celtic twilight of his early work to something harder and stranger. The Second Coming, imagining a rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem, writing of gyres and historical cycles, of Byzantium and Irish Civil War, creating a personal mythology that somehow spoke to the age's anxiety and violence. His later poetry achieved a kind of magnificent bitterness. An aged man is but a paltry thing, refusing to go gentle, insisting on the body and its demands even as death approached, proving that poetry could grow stronger with age, could find new powers in decline. In America, Wallace Stevens was writing poems that treated poetry itself as subject, the idea of order, the necessary angel, the supreme fiction working as an insurance executive while composing verse of extraordinary philosophical depth. 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Bird, showing how perspective shapes reality, how imagination creates the world we inhabit. William Carlos. Williams countered the European influence with a determinedly American idiom. No ideas, but in things, he insisted, writing about red wheelbarrows and plums in the iceboxes, finding poetry in the immediate, the local, the everyday object precisely observed, his variable foot trying to capture American speech rhythms in verse form. Marianne Moore created poems from unlikely materials, observations of animals, descriptions of baseball, quotations from scientific journals, all assembled with syllabic precision. Her stanzas shaped by count rather than stress, proving that poetry could be made from anything, that the poetic eye could transform any subject, The Harlem Renaissance brought African American voices into the mainstream. Langston Hughes writing in blues rhythms and jazz syncopation, making poetry from black vernacular, celebrating black culture while protesting racism. I, too, sing America, claiming a place at the table that had been denied, showing that poetry could be political without sacrificing art. Claude McKay wrote sonnets of rage and pride. If We Must Die, becoming an anthem of resistance, using the traditional form to speak revolutionary sentiments, and County Cullen explored the double consciousness of being black in America through classical verse forms, the tension between heritage and education, between what he was told to be and what he was. In the Soviet Union, poetry became dangerous. Vladimir Mayakovsky, serving the revolution with his verse, writing propaganda that was somehow also art until disillusionment led to suicide. And Anna Akhmatova survived Stalin's terror, her son imprisoned, her friends executed, writing Requiem as a memorial to all who suffered, poems so dangerous she burned them after memorizing them, trusting friends to hold the lines in memory until it was safe to write them down again. Osip Mandelstam wrote a satirical epigram about Stalin, comparing his fingers to fat grubs, and died in a transit camp, his widow preserving his work by memorization, carrying it through decades of persecution, proving that poetry could matter enough to die for, that it posed a threat to totalitarian power precisely because it insisted on individual voice. On truth-telling, Pablo Neruda in Chile was writing odes to common things, to the onion and the artichoke and salt, elevating the humble through attention and love, his 20 love poems becoming one of the most widely read collections in any language, and his canto general attempting an epic of the Americas, indigenous history and colonial violence and revolutionary hope, all braided together. Federico Garcia Lorca in Spain created a poetry of duende, that dark sound, that awareness of death that makes flamenco and bullfighting and poetry urgent and real, his gypsy ballads mixing folk tradition with surrealist imagery. Before he was shot by fascist forces at the start of the Spanish Civil War, another poet martyred for his art and his politics. The Second World War produced its own poets. Keith Douglas writing from tank battles in North Africa, dying in Normandy at 24, his verse stripped of illusion, seeing war clearly without romanticizing or condemning it, just reporting what he saw with terrible precision. And after the war, after Hiroshima and the Holocaust, poetry had to find ways to continue. Theodor Adorno famously questioned whether poetry was possible after Auschwitz, and Paul Celan answered by writing it anyway, in German, the language of the perpetrators. His death fugue, making music from atrocity, repeating and varying its themes like a Bach fugue. Black milk of daybreak, golden hair and ashen hair, language pushed to its limits to speak the unspeakable. The confessional poets in America made their private lives public. Robert Lowell writing about mental illness and family history and life studies. Sylvia Plath transforming personal pain into mythic imagery. Her aerial poems burning with fury and precision, each word chosen to cut, to reveal, to make the internal external. Anne Sexton wrote about subjects that had been taboo, menstruation and abortion and female desire, therapy sessions and suicide attempts, using traditional form, sonnets and ballads, to contain explosive content, showing that the personal could be political, that women's experiences deserved the dignity of art. The beat poets rejected all this. Allen Ginsberg howling against American conformity, writing long Whitman-esque lines that tried to capture spontaneous thought. Jazz improvisation rendered in verse. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, making poetry performance, making it public and urgent and dangerous. Again, in Latin America, poets were experimenting with form and politics. Cesar Vallejo, writing from Peruvian indigenous experience, his trilce fracturing Spanish syntax and grammar to express a vision that couldn't be contained in conventional language, and Octavio Paz exploring surrealism and Mexican identity, writing The Labyrinth of Solitude as both poetry and philosophy, essay and verse blurring together. The Irish tradition continued strong, Seamus Heaney digging with his pen, writing of peat bogs and rural childhood and the troubles in Northern Ireland, making poetry from local materials that somehow became universal, winning the Nobel Prize and proving that regional poetry could speak to the world. Derek Walcott in the Caribbean was creating an epic for the West Indies. Omeros transplanting Homer to the islands, giving voice to a post-colonial experience that honored both African heritage and European education, refusing to choose between them, insisting on complexity and mixture. Elizabeth Bishop traveled constantly, writing postcards from everywhere, her poetry marked by careful observation and emotional restraint. One art, making disaster look easy through a villanelle, the repetition and rhyme containing and controlling loss, showing that form could be feelings opposite and its perfect vessel at once. The Black Arts movement in America insisted on poetry as weapon and tool. Amiri Baraka, writing verse that rejected white aesthetics, that celebrated black power and demanded revolution. Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez making poetry oral again, meant for performance, for the stage and the street corner, not just the page. And women poets were claiming space everywhere. Adrienne Rich transforming from formal poet to feminist revolutionary, her diving into the wreck, exploring what it meant to be a woman writer, to salvage something true from the shipwreck of patriarchal culture. Audre Lorde insisting that the master's tools would never dismantle the master's house, making poetry from rage and love and the intersections of race and gender and sexuality. The late 20th century saw poetry fragment further, language poetry in America questioning whether meaning itself was possible, using words as materials rather than messages, and new formalism reviving traditional meters and rhymes, insisting that craft still mattered, that innovation didn't require the abandonment of every technique from the past. Poets from formerly colonized nations were writing back to empire, using English transformed by other tongues, other cadences, creating post-colonial poetry that was neither purely indigenous nor purely Western, but something new, something hybrid and powerful. And as the century ended, poetry seemed both more diverse and more marginalized than ever, no longer the central art form it had been when Homer sang or Shakespeare wrote, but still somehow necessary, still being written in every language on earth, still finding readers who needed what only poetry could provide. The voices multiplied, crossing borders and languages, translated and mistranslated and translated again, each poet adding to the garden that now stretched across every continent, every culture, a vast accumulation of human expression in verse, all of it somehow in conversation, Homer still speaking to Walcott, Sappho answering Plath, the dead and the living all present in their words. And standing in this garden now, at the beginning of a new millennium, looking back across 4,000 years or more, the mind begins to wonder what it all means, this persistent human need to shape language into patterns, to make rhythm and image and metaphor, to speak in verse when prose would be easier. Perhaps it begins with breath, with the fact that poetry is tied to the body in ways other writing is not. The line breaks mimicking inhalation and exhalation, the meter echoing the heartbeat, making language physical, making it something felt in the chest and throat before it reaches the mind. The earliest poems were oral, meant to be spoken and heard, and even now, when most poetry is encountered silently on a page, it carries that memory of voice, of breath-shaping sound, of the mouth-forming words that please not just through meaning, but through the sensation of speaking them. The way cellar door is said to be the most beautiful phrase in English, not for what it means, but for how it feels to say it. And there is something about compression, about saying more with less, that seems essential to how humans process experience. We cannot hold everything in consciousness at once, cannot carry the full weight of reality without some way to distill it, to concentrate it. And poetry is perhaps the ultimate distillation, the reduction of complex feeling and thought to its essence. A haiku captures a moment so precisely that the moment expands, becomes infinite. The frog jumping into the pond contains all transience, all the surprise of existence, 17 syllables doing what pages of prose might attempt and fail to achieve. This is why poetry appears in every culture, every language, every era, because the human brain seems to crave pattern and variation, repetition with difference, the comfort of the expected and the pleasure of surprise. Meter giving us the pattern, metaphor providing the surprise. And together they create something that satisfies at levels deeper than the purely rational. Children naturally speak in rhythm, in rhyme, making up nonsense songs before they can construct logical arguments, suggesting that poetry is somehow fundamental to how we acquire and process language, that it comes before prose, before the measured explanations and linear narratives we learn later. And there is the way poetry creates community, the shared knowledge of certain lines, certain poems that bind people together across time and distance. Every English speaker knows to be or not to be. Even if they've never read Hamlet, knows I wandered lonely as a cloud, knows fragments of verse that have become part of the cultural atmosphere we breathe. In oral cultures, this was even more pronounced. Everyone knew the same stories, the same songs, the shared repertoire creating a common ground, a way of understanding the world together, and when a poet performed, the audience could participate, could complete the formulaic phrases, could sing along with familiar passages, making poetry a collective rather than solitary experience. Even now, even in our fragmented modern world, people memorize poems, carry them internally, whisper lines to themselves in moments of crisis or joy. And this internalization creates an intimacy unlike other art forms. The poem becomes part of your own thought, your own voice, speaking to you in your own mind, with your own accent, but in words someone else chose centuries ago. There is power in this, in the way a dead poet can live inside you, can speak when you need them. Emily Dickinson, writing, "Hope is the thing with feathers, becomes your own hope, becomes the language you use to understand your own emotion, the poet giving you words you didn't have, frameworks you didn't know you needed, and rhythm does something mysterious to memory. Something about the regularity of meter makes words stick. Advertisers know this, using jingles and slogans that lodge in the brain through repetition and rhyme. But poetry uses the same mechanism for deeper purposes, encoding wisdom, warning, celebration, making the memorable more likely to be remembered, passing it forward to the next generation. Perhaps this explains the survival of certain poems across centuries. The ones that endure are not always the most complex or the most profound in their ideas, but the ones whose music is so perfect that they cannot be paraphrased, cannot be said any other way. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The meaning is simple, but the music is irreplaceable. And so it persists. And there is something else, something about poetry's relationship to truth. The way it can be factually, false, but emotionally true, metaphorically accurate, even when literally impossible. Dawn's lovers are not actually a compass, but the comparison reveals something about their relationship that a literal description never could. The metaphor creates a truth that didn't exist before the poem made it. This is why poetry is dangerous to authoritarian regimes, why dictators imprison poets, why verses can start revolutions, because poetry makes claims that cannot be fact-checked, operates at levels of meaning that evade simple yes or no verification. It slips past the censors by working through suggestion and image, through meanings that resonate rather than meanings that can be pinned down. And in personal life, but poetry gives us language for what resists language, for grief and love and wonder and terror, the states where ordinary speech fails, where we stammer and fall silent. The poet has already been there, has found words for the wordless, and offers them to us like gifts, like tools we can use to shape our own experiences. The garden stretches on, infinitely various, and yet there are common themes that appear again and again across cultures and centuries. The Carpe Diem poems urging us to seize the day because time is short. The Obads marking lovers' reluctant partings at dawn. The Elegies mourning the dead. The Odes celebrating beauty or truth or a Grecian urn. These recurrent forms suggest that certain human experiences are universal, that a Chinese poet in the 8th century and an Irish poet in the 20th might both write about exile, about longing for home, and their poems might speak to each other across the gap of language and time, might reveal that consciousness, for all its particularity, shares certain contours, certain concerns that transcend the individual. And standing here at the edge of the garden as twilight deepens, watching the last light fade from the paths where the poets walk, there is a sense of gratitude for all these voices, all these attempts to capture the uncapturable, to make the invisible visible through arrangement of words on a page or in the air. The garden grows quieter now, the voices becoming whispers, becoming echoes, and the mind drifts among them without urgency, without the need to choose or compare or rank, simply moving from one voice to another, listening to the music each one makes, the particular rhythm and diction that marks each poet as themselves. Homer is still singing somewhere in the dusk, his long lines rolling like waves, and Sappho's fragments still burn bright, brief flames in the gathering dark, Dante walks through his three realms, forever ascending, and Milton's blank verse still wrestles with paradise and its loss. The romantics wander among the trees, Wordsworth finding intimations of immortality in the evening light. Keats listening to a nightingale that is every nightingale, singing of summer in full-throated ease, and Byron broods magnificently while Shelley chases visions only he can see. Dickinson moves quietly in her corner, tending her private garden of death and eternity, while Whitman sprawls on the grass nearby, containing multitudes, celebrating the body electric, the two of them opposite and complementary, the compressed and the expansive, the hidden and the public, both American, both essential. The moderns have built their fragmentary monuments. Eliot's wasteland still waiting for rain. Pound's cantos still trying to include history, and Stevens still meditating on the imagination's supreme fictions, while Williams finds infinity in the local, in the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater, and the voices continue, beyond counting, beyond cataloging, each one adding something irreplaceable to the vast conversation, the poets dead and living all speaking at once, their words overlapping and harmonizing and contradicting and completing each other, creating a chorus that has been singing since language began and will continue as long as humans draw breath and arrange it into patterns. The light is nearly gone now, the garden dissolving into darkness, but the voices remain, disembodied, pure sound and sense floating in the night air. And it doesn't matter that most of these poets never met, never knew each other's work, because the poems themselves create the connections, build bridges across the chasms of time and space and death. This is the miracle of poetry, that it defeats time, that Sappho still speaks, though her civilization is dust, that Homer still sings though we don't even know if he existed, that words carefully chosen and arranged can outlast empires, can survive the languages they were written in, can be translated and transformed, and still carry something essential, still move readers millennia after the hand that wrote them return to earth. And so the garden persists, adding new voices, new visions, never complete, never finished, always growing, a living tradition that requires only attention and memory, readers willing to listen, willing to carry the words forward, willing to let dead poets live again in their minds and hearts. The paths grow dim, the figures fade, but the words remain, suspended in the air like stars, points of light in the darkness, each one a human voice reaching across the void, saying, I was here, I saw this, I felt this, and hoping someone, someday, somewhere, would hear and understand and answer. And perhaps that is what poetry finally is. Not the garden or the voices or the forms or the traditions, but the reaching, the attempt to connect, to bridge the fundamental loneliness of consciousness, to say what cannot be said and have someone else recognize it anyway, to make music from breath and meaning from sound and beauty, from the strange fact of being alive and aware in an improbable universe. The night deepens, the garden becomes invisible, but the words still whisper in the darkness, still sing their ancient songs, still offer what they have always offered, companionship, beauty, truth, the accumulated wisdom and wonder of 4,000 years of human beings trying to speak what is deepest in them, trying to leave something behind that matters, that lasts, that might comfort or challenge or change someone they will never meet. And in the silence that follows, in the pause between one breath and the next, there is only gratitude for all of it, for every line ever written, every metaphor ever made, every rhyme and rhythm and image, the whole vast, gorgeous, impossible accumulation of poetry, still here, still speaking, still alive in anyone who takes the time to listen. The voices fade to whispers, the whispers fade to silence, and in that silence there is peace, the deep quiet that comes after great music, after the last note has been played and still hangs in the air, vibrating, slowly diminishing, but never quite disappearing, never entirely gone. There is a particular quality to the way silence settles over a battlefield once the smoke has cleared, a stillness that feels impossibly vast, as if the earth itself is holding its breath, and in that quiet space there exists a kind of reverence, not for what has been, but for the sheer enormity of what was. Tonight, I find myself standing in the imagination at the edge of such a place, somewhere in the rolling countryside of Europe, where the grass grows tall now, and the wind moves through it in long, sweeping gestures, carrying with it no memory of thunder, no echo of drums, just the patient rustling of stems and seeds, the soft conversation of leaves. The light here is gentle, filtered through clouds that move slowly across a pale sky, and there is a coolness in the air, the kind that speaks of rain having passed, or perhaps preparing to arrive, and the land beneath my feet feels solid, ancient, as if it has witnessed countless seasons, countless transformations, and has learned to simply exist, without judgment, without haste. I imagine walking through this landscape, not with any particular destination in mind, but with a quiet curiosity about what might be found here, what traces remain of a time when this very ground trembled with the movement of thousands, when the horizon was broken not by church steeples and farm cottages, but by columns of soldiers, by artillery batteries, by the ordered chaos of armies on the march. There is something deeply meditative about contemplating such vastness, the way history unfolds across terrain like water flowing over stone, shaping everything it touches, leaving marks both visible and invisible. And I find myself drawn to the details, the small particulars that bring a moment into focus, the way morning mist might have gathered in the valleys, the sound of wheels turning on dirt roads, the smell of wood smoke from 1,000 campfires. Europe, in the early years of the 1800s, was a place of extraordinary transformation, a continent caught between old certainties and new possibilities, where the structures that had held societies together for generations were beginning to crack and shift, where ideas about power and governance and human rights were colliding in ways both violent and profound. And at the center of this tumultuous period, like a storm that gathers energy from the very air around it, was a figure whose influence would reshape not just battlefields, but the political and social landscape of an entire age, a man whose name would become synonymous with ambition, with military genius, with the complexities of leadership and the costs of conquest. But before we arrive at that center, before we trace the movements of armies and the decisions of generals, it feels important to simply linger here in this imagined landscape, where the present and the past exist side by side, where a field of wheat might grow over ground that once knew the thunder of cavalry charges, where a quiet village road might follow the same path that supply wagons traveled, their wheels cutting deep ruts into mud. The thing about history, the thing that makes it so endlessly fascinating, is that it is never really just one story. It is thousands of stories, woven together, overlapping and diverging, each one containing within it the full complexity of the human experience, the courage and the fear, the brilliance and the folly, the moments of connection and the vast stretches of loneliness. And so, as I stand here, in this peaceful place that exists more in thought than in any specific location, I feel the weight of those stories beginning to gather, not pressing down, but simply accumulating like morning dew on grass, each droplet catching light, each one holding its own small reflection of something larger. The wind shifts slightly, bringing with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance I can hear the faint sound of water, perhaps a stream moving over stones, and I realize that this quiet attention to the world as it is perhaps the best way to begin understanding the world as it was, because the Napoleonic Wars, that great span of conflict that stretched across more than a decade, touching nearly every corner of Europe and reaching even beyond into Egypt and the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, that period of history which saw the rise and fall of empires, the redrawing of borders, the transformation of military strategy and political thought. It all began, as most things do, not with grand pronouncements, but with smaller shifts, with tensions building, with old orders crumbling, with opportunity appearing in the spaces where certainty used to be. And now, with the scene set, with the atmosphere established, we can begin to trace those beginnings, to follow the threads backward, to understand how Europe arrived at this moment of profound upheaval, and how one man's extraordinary trajectory would become inseparable from the fate of nations. The story begins, as so many stories of upheaval do, with a revolution. France, in the 1790s, was a nation tearing itself apart, reimagining itself, trying to become something it had never been before. The old monarchy had fallen. King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had been executed, their deaths marking not just the end of individual lives, but the collapse of an entire system of governance that had seemed for centuries as permanent as the stones of Versailles. The revolution that swept through France beginning in 1789 was not a single event, but a cascade of transformations, each one building upon the last, each one releasing energies that had been suppressed for generations. It was philosophical and violent, idealistic and chaotic, driven by Enlightenment dreams of liberty and equality, but also by hunger, by rage, by the settling of old scores, and into this churning cauldron of change, into a France that was simultaneously trying to defend itself from external enemies and define itself from within, stepped a young officer from Corsica, an island that had only recently become French territory, a place that felt, in many ways, more Italian than French, more Mediterranean than continental. Napoleon Bonaparte, born Napoleone di Bonaparte in 1769, was 24 years old when the revolution truly began to reshape his world. He was small in stature, just driven by an intensity that some found unsettling, educated at military academies in France, trained in artillery, the technical branch of warfare that required mathematical precision, an understanding of trajectories and angles, of how to make cannons speak with devastating accuracy. His family was minor nobility, struggling to maintain position, and young Napoleon, the second of 8 surviving children, had grown up with a fierce awareness of status, of hierarchies, of the ways power could be gained or lost. He read voraciously histories and philosophies, absorbing the lessons of ancient Rome, of Alexander, of Caesar, imagining himself into narratives of conquest and glory. But in 1793 he was still largely unknown, still finding his way through the complex and dangerous politics of revolutionary France, where yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's traitor, where factions rose and fell with bewildering speed, where the guillotine worked tirelessly in public squares, its blade rising and falling, rising and falling. The moment that changed everything, the moment that brought Napoleon from obscurity into the light of attention, came at a coastal town called Toulon, where royalist forces opposed to the revolution had seized control, inviting in the British Navy to support them, creating a strategic nightmare for the revolutionary government. Napoleon, serving as an artillery officer, saw what others had missed. He understood that controlling the high ground, the forts overlooking the harbor, would make the British position untenable. He planned the assault with meticulous care, positioned his guns with mathematical precision, and when the attack came, it succeeded. The British ships withdrew. The town fell back into revolutionary hands, and Napoleon, wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, suddenly had a reputation. He was 24 years old, and he had proven himself not through reckless courage, though he had that, but through strategic thinking, through the ability to see the geometry of battle, to understand how terrain and firepower could be combined to create decisive results. The recognition came swiftly. Promotion to brigadier general, assignments of increasing importance, but the path was never smooth, because revolutionary France was a place where fortune could reverse in an instant, and Napoleon, for all his growing reputation, was still vulnerable to the shifting political winds. In 1795, he found himself in Paris, somewhat sidelined, his career uncertain, watching as the revolution continued to devour itself, as new constitutions were written and discarded, as power consolidated around a 5-member directory that governed France with varying degrees of competence and corruption. And then, in October of that year, royalist forces within Paris itself rose up, threatening to overthrow the directory, thousands of armed insurgents moving through the streets, converging on the Tuileries Palace, and the government, desperate, turned to Napoleon, giving him command of the forces defending the regime. He had almost no time to prepare, but he remembered the lessons of Toulon. He understood the power of artillery, and he sent a young cavalry officer, a man named Murat, who would later become one of his most famous marshals, to seize the cannons stored at a nearby military depot. And when the royalist columns advanced, confident in their numbers, Napoleon unleashed what he would later call, with characteristic bluntness, a whiff of grape shot. The cannons fired, loaded with grape shot, hundreds of small metal balls that turned each gun into a giant shotgun, scything through the advancing crowds. The sound was tremendous, echoing off the buildings, rolling through the narrow streets like thunder. And the insurgent forces, faced with this devastating firepower, broke and scattered. The uprising collapsed in a matter of hours. Napoleon had saved the Directory, and his reward was rapid and substantial. Command of the Army of Italy, one of the major French forces, an appointment that would change not just his life, but the course of European history. Italy in 1796 was a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, many of them under Austrian influence, and the French army stationed there was undersupplied, demoralized, poorly equipped, facing Austrian and Piedmontese forces that seemed better organized, better funded, more confident. Napoleon arrived and immediately began transforming everything. His energy was relentless. He reorganized supply lines, imposed discipline, but also inspired his soldiers with a kind of electric enthusiasm. He promised them not just victory, but glory and plunder, the riches of Italian cities, the satisfaction of defeating enemies who had seemed invincible. His strategy was bold, almost reckless. He moved with a speed that caught his opponents off balance, striking at the seam between the Austrian and Piedmontese armies, preventing them from coordinating, defeating them in detail, one after another, at Montenotte, at Lodi, at Arcole, at Rivoli, each battle a master class in rapid movement, in concentration of force, in the element of surprise. The crossing of the bridge at Lodi became legendary. Austrian forces defending the far side, Napoleon personally leading the assault, urging his men forward across the narrow span, under withering fire, the moment crystallizing his image as a commander who shared the dangers of his soldiers, who led from the front, who seemed to bear a charmed life. Within a year, he had conquered much of northern Italy, forced Austria to the negotiating table, and returned to France as a hero. The young general from Corsica was now, at 28 years old, the most celebrated military commander in Europe. His victories had brought desperately needed gold and supplies back to France. His dispatches, carefully crafted to emphasize his achievements, were read aloud in Paris to cheering crowds. But Napoleon was already thinking beyond Italy, already imagining grander campaigns, and when the opportunity came to lead an expedition to Egypt, to strike at British interests in the Mediterranean and the routes to India, to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, he seized it with both hands. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 was both triumph and disaster, a strange combination of military success and strategic failure. Napoleon conquered Egypt with relative ease, defeating the Mamluk armies at the Battle of the Pyramids, entering Cairo as a conqueror, presenting himself as a liberator, bringing French scholars and scientists who would study and document the ancient wonders of the Nile Valley. But the British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at Abu Qir Bay in the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon and his army in Egypt, cutting them off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any easy path home, and Napoleon, always attuned to political currents, began to sense that the situation in France was deteriorating, that the Directory was losing control. That opportunity was calling from across the Mediterranean. He abandoned his army in Egypt, left them under the command of subordinates, and sailed back to France in 1799, a risky journey that could have ended in capture, but instead ended with his arrival in Paris, where he found, as he had suspected, a government in crisis, a nation hungry for strong leadership, for someone who could restore order, who could protect the gains of the revolution while ending its chaos. The coup that brought Napoleon to power, known as the coup of 18th Brumaire, was almost farcical in its execution. Nervous speeches, confused legislators, Napoleon himself tongue-tied and uncertain at crucial moments, but backed by loyal troops, supported by his brother Lucien, who was president of the council. The coup succeeded. The Directory was dissolved, and a new government emerged, the Consulate. With Napoleon as first consul, he was 30 years old, and he now controlled France. Not as a king, the revolution had made that impossible, but as something new. A leader who claimed to embody the will of the people, who promised stability without tyranny, progress without chaos, a figure who would, in the years to come, crown himself emperor, but who began, in those first months of 1800, as the man who promised to heal a wounded nation. The France that Napoleon inherited was exhausted, but also hungry for something it had lost in the years of revolutionary turmoil, a sense of possibility tempered by order. And he set about providing exactly that, with an energy that seemed to defy the need for sleep, for rest, for anything but constant motion and decision-making. He rose early, worked late, consumed information like a man starving for it, reports from prefects, intelligence from abroad, financial statements, diplomatic correspondence. His mind was a machine for processing detail, for finding patterns, for making connections that others missed. And he expected the same intensity from everyone around him. Secretaries who could barely keep pace, ministers summoned at all hours, a court that revolved entirely around his will. But this was not mere tyranny, or at least not only tyranny, because Napoleon understood something fundamental about power, that it must deliver results. That legitimacy comes not just from force, but from achievement, from making people's lives tangibly better. And so even as he consolidated control, even as he limited press freedom and suppressed opposition, he also reformed France from top to bottom. The Napoleonic Code, the civil law system he commissioned and personally helped shape, became perhaps his most enduring legacy. It swept away the tangled mess of feudal laws and regional customs that had governed France before the Revolution, replacing them with a clear, rational, unified legal framework. It established equality before the law, protected property rights, secularized marriage, made divorce possible, though harder for women than for men. It was both progressive and conservative, both revolutionary and traditional, much like Napoleon himself. The Concordat with the Catholic Church, signed in 1801, healed another wound, restoring some of the Church's position in French life, but carefully, on terms that kept the institution subordinate to the state. Napoleon understood that most French people remained Catholic, that their faith mattered to them, but he also understood that the revolution's anti-clerical impulses had struck at real abuses, real concentrations of unaccountable power, and so he sought a middle way, one that brought stability without surrendering control, education, infrastructure, administration. He touched all of it, creating lycées to train future leaders, establishing the Bank of France to stabilize currency, organizing the country into departments governed by appointed prefects who reported directly to Paris, building roads and canals, commissioning monuments, everything calculated to demonstrate that France under Napoleon was efficient, powerful, modern, a state that worked, but France could not exist in isolation, and Napoleon knew it. Europe's old monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain above all, watched his rise with deep suspicion. They had gone to war against revolutionary France multiple times, trying to crush the revolution, to restore the Bourbon monarchy, and now this Corsican upstart who commanded French armies with unsettling brilliance, who seemed to win battle after battle, who spoke of destiny and glory. He was, in their eyes, both the heir to the revolution's chaos and something new, something potentially more dangerous. The Peace of Amiens, signed with Britain in 1802, was brief, fragile, a temporary pause in hostilities that both sides knew would not last. Napoleon used it to consolidate, to prepare, to build the foundations of what would become his empire. And when war resumed in 1803, it resumed with a new intensity, a new scale. Britain formed the Third Coalition, drawing in Austria and Russia, and Napoleon, now crowned Emperor of the French in an elaborate ceremony in 1804, where he placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope. Napoleon prepared to meet them, assembling what would become known as the Grande Armée, the Great Army, along the Channel coast, ostensibly for an invasion of Britain, though that invasion would never come. The British Navy was too strong, too experienced, and at Trafalgar, in October of 1805, Admiral Nelson, even as he died from a French sharpshooter's bullet, secured British naval supremacy for a generation, destroying the combined French and Spanish fleets, ensuring that Britain would remain unconquerable, that Napoleon's empire, however vast it became on land, would always face an enemy it could not reach, could not defeat, could not silence. But on land, Napoleon was about to demonstrate military genius at its apex. The Austrian army was marching west, confident, well supplied, supported by Russian forces moving to join them, and Napoleon, with that same speed that had served him in Italy, broke camp along the Channel, wheeled his entire army eastward, and moved with such velocity that he caught the Austrians completely unprepared. At Ulm, in October of 1805, he surrounded an entire Austrian army, cutting it off from supply and support, forcing its surrender without a major battle. 30,000 men simply captured, removed from the board, and Napoleon marched on toward Vienna, which he entered without resistance, the Austrian capital occupied by French forces, a humiliation that would have seemed impossible mere months before. But the real test came in December in Moravia, at a place called Austerlitz, where Napoleon faced the combined might of the Austrian and Russian emperors, their forces outnumbering his, their confidence high, their position, they believed, advantageous. Napoleon planned the battle with the care of a master chess player. He studied the terrain, the rolling hills, the frozen ponds, the morning mist that would cloak the field. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable, inviting attack, and when the Allied forces took the bait, pushing hard against that seemingly weak position, he unleashed his real blow, a massive assault against their center, cutting their army in two, sending one half reeling back, driving the other onto the frozen lakes where French artillery shattered the ice, plunging men and horses into freezing water. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, was his masterpiece, a victory so complete, so devastating, that it shattered the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace immediately. Russia withdrew its forces, and Napoleon stood astride Europe like a colossus, redrawing borders, creating new kingdoms for his brothers and marshals, dissolving the ancient Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for 1,000 years, simply erasing it from the map. The years that followed, 1806 through 1807, saw more campaigns, more victories. Prussia. Proud Prussia, with its military traditions stretching back to Frederick the Great, entered the war in 1806 and was crushed with shocking speed. Napoleon defeated the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt on the same day. Twin battles fought simultaneously, both resulting in Prussian collapse, and within weeks, French forces occupied Berlin. The Prussian king fled east, seeking Russian protection. The campaign pushed into Poland, into the bitter cold of an Eastern European winter, and at Eylau in February of 1807. Napoleon fought one of his bloodiest battles, a grinding, brutal engagement in a snowstorm, where neither side could claim clear victory, where the dead piled up in drifts, where the cost of glory became visible in ways that made even Napoleon pause, though only briefly. By summer, at Friedland, he had recovered his momentum, crushing the Russian army, forcing Tsar Alexander to negotiate, and the two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit in July of 1807 to divide Europe between them, France dominant in the west, Russia given a free hand in the east, an alliance that seemed to promise peace, stability, a new order. Napoleon was 38 years old, master of an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to southern Italy. He had redrawn the map of Europe, defeated every major power except Britain, and he seemed, to many observers, to have achieved something permanent, something that would last. But empires are hungry things. They must expand or contract. They cannot remain still. And Napoleon, for all his genius, could not see the cracks already forming in the structure he had built, could not recognize that his very success was creating the conditions for his downfall, the continental system, his attempt to strangle British trade by closing European ports to British goods required constant enforcement, constant vigilance. It created hardship for European merchants and consumers who wanted British products. It bred resentment, smuggling, resistance, and it pulled Napoleon into conflicts he might otherwise have avoided. Spain, in 1808, became a wound that would not heal. Napoleon deposed the Spanish Bourbon king, placed his brother Joseph on the throne, and expected Spain to accept this as other nations had accepted his reorganizations. But Spain erupted, not in conventional warfare, but in guerrilla resistance, irregular forces striking from mountains and villages, melting away before French counterattacks, tying down hundreds of thousands of troops, bleeding the empire slowly, relentlessly. The British, sensing opportunity, sent an expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, to support the Spanish and Portuguese resistance. And what began as a sideshow became a running sore, a constant drain on French resources and prestige, the Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon would later call it, that consumed men and money and time. And yet, even as Spain festered, Napoleon was planning something grander, something that would dwarf all his previous campaigns. Because Russia, despite the Treaty of Tilsit, was drifting away from the continental system, trading with Britain, asserting its independence, and Napoleon, who could not tolerate defiance, who saw opposition as a challenge to be crushed, began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men, drawn from across the empire, French, Germans, Italians, Poles, a multinational force of staggering size, organized with typical Napoleonic precision, divided into corps that could operate independently, supported by massive supply trains, all aimed at a single objective: to march into Russia, to force Tsar Alexander to submit, to demonstrate once and for all that Napoleon was invincible. In June of 1812, they crossed the Niemen River, the same river where Napoleon and Alexander had met 5 years before to divide the world, and began the long march east into distances that seemed to have no end, into a landscape that swallowed armies whole. The Russian campaign began with confidence, with the assurance that had carried Napoleon through so many previous victories. But Russia was different, vast in ways that defied European understanding, a country where distance itself became a weapon, where the horizon always promised another horizon beyond it, where armies could march for weeks and still find themselves far from anything that mattered. The Russian strategy, whether planned or improvised, was to retreat, to draw the French deeper and deeper into the interior, to stretch their supply lines until they became threads, gossamer thin and ready to snap. French forces won battles at Smolensk, at Valutino, but these were hollow victories, because the Russian army always withdrew, always remained intact, always positioned itself just beyond reach. Napoleon pushed forward, driven by the belief that one decisive battle would end it, that the Russians would eventually stand and fight and be destroyed, as so many other armies had been destroyed. And in September, at a village called Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, the Russians finally stopped retreating. They fortified positions along ridges and hills and waited for the French to come. The Battle of Borodino was carnage on a scale that shocked even veterans of Napoleon's previous campaigns. The French attacked. The Russians held. Batteries of artillery on both sides fired until the gunners were deafened, until the smoke became so thick it blotted out the sun. Infantry charged and countercharged across fields that became slaughterhouses. The fighting lasted from dawn until evening, neither side giving ground easily, neither side willing to break. When night finally fell, when the guns at last went silent, 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The butcher's bill split almost evenly between the two armies. The Russians, their forces too damaged to continue, withdrew during the night, leaving a Napoleon in possession of the battlefield, technically victorious, but at a cost that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier campaigns. A week later, the Grande Armée entered Moscow, the ancient capital, expecting to find submission. Instead, they found a city largely abandoned, and within hours, fires began, spreading through the wooden structures, consuming neighborhoods, turning the sky orange and black, whether set by Russian patriots or simply the chaos of occupation. The fires destroyed much of the city, leaving the French army camped among ruins, waiting for a surrender that never came. Napoleon remained in Moscow for 5 weeks, a strange interlude, as autumn deepened and the first frosts appeared. He sent letters to Tsar Alexander, proposing peace, offering terms, receiving no reply. The silence from St. Petersburg was absolute, and slowly, reluctantly, Napoleon began to understand that he had walked into a trap of his own making. The retreat began in October, and almost immediately the weather turned. Early winter storms brought snow and freezing temperatures. The Grande Armée, already weakened by battle and disease, by the long march into Russia and the weeks camped in Moscow's ruins, began to disintegrate, not through defeat in battle, but through the relentless arithmetic of cold and hunger. Soldiers abandoned equipment to move faster, then abandoned weapons, then abandoned everything but the will to keep moving. Supply wagons broke down. Horses died by the thousands, and Cossack cavalry. Russian irregular forces harried the columns constantly, picking off stragglers, attacking foraging parties, turning the retreat into a running nightmare at the Berezina River, with Russian armies closing in from multiple directions. French engineers built bridges under fire, in freezing water, while the remnants of the army struggled across, pushing and shoving, desperate to escape the trap. Thousands drowned, thousands more were captured, and when Napoleon finally crossed back into Poland in December, when he finally escaped Russian territory, he had perhaps 30,000 combat-effective troops left, out of the more than 600,000 who had crossed the Niemen in June. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. An entire army, the finest force Napoleon had ever assembled, essentially destroyed, not in a single catastrophic battle, but through a slow hemorrhage of men and materiel across 1,000 miles of retreat. And the political consequences rippled outward immediately. Prussia, which had been forced into alliance with France, saw its opportunity and switched sides. Austria, always waiting for the moment when Napoleon's luck would turn, began preparing for war, and across Germany, nationalist sentiment stirred, a sense that perhaps the great emperor was not invincible after all, that perhaps the time had come to throw off French domination. Napoleon returned to Paris, left his army to struggle home under its marshals, and immediately began rebuilding, calling up new conscripts, boys of 16 and 17, men who should have been farmers or apprentices, pressing them into service, drilling them, equipping them with whatever could be manufactured or found. And by spring of 1813, he had assembled another army, smaller than before, less experienced, but still formidable. The campaign in Germany that followed, the War of the Sixth Coalition, was a desperate affair. Napoleon won battles at Lutzen and Bautzen, showing that he could still outmaneuver and defeat his enemies, but he could not win decisively, could not replicate the crushing victories of Austerlitz or Jena, because his enemies had learned. They avoided set-piece battles where Napoleon's genius could shine. They coordinated their movements. They waited for advantages, and slowly, through the summer and fall, they ground down French forces through sheer weight of numbers. At Leipzig, in October of 1813, in what became known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, more than 300,000 Allied troops surrounding his position, and for 3 days the battle raged across fields and through villages, French forces fighting with desperate courage, knowing that this might be their last chance, but outnumbered, outgunned, slowly being pushed back compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, when his forces attempted to withdraw across the Elster River, the bridge was blown prematurely, trapping thousands on the wrong side, and the Grande Armée, what remained of it, staggered back toward France, defeated, exhausted, leaving Germany to the Allies. By the start of 1814, Allied armies were crossing into France itself, Russian, Prussian, Austrian forces advancing from the east, British and Spanish forces pushing across the Pyrenees from the south, and Napoleon, with perhaps 70,000 troops, faced more than 500,000 enemies converging on Paris. The mathematics were impossible, the situation hopeless. And yet, the campaign he fought that winter and spring, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, defending his own territory for the first time, showed flashes of the old brilliance, rapid marches that caught Allied columns separated, attacks that hit with precision at Champaubert, at Montmirail, at Montereau, small victories that reminded everyone why this man had once seemed unstoppable. But individual victories could not change the overall equation. Paris fell in March. The Senate, filled with men Napoleon had appointed, voted to depose him, his marshals, exhausted, seeing no path to victory, urged him to abdicate. And finally, in April of 1814, he signed the document, gave up the throne, accepted exile to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast, close enough to see the mainland, far enough to be isolated. The Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returned from exile to claim a throne that must have felt strange after 23 years of revolution and empire, and Europe's diplomats gathered in Vienna to redraw borders, to restore old dynasties, to try to put the pieces back together after more than 2 decades of nearly continuous warfare. Napoleon, on Elba, was supposed to fade into history to accept his small realm, his pension from France, his title of Emperor of Elba, which sounded almost comical, but exile did not suit him. And when news reached him of discontent in France, of the unpopularity of the restored Bourbons, of veterans who remembered glory and resented the return to the old ways, he made a decision that would give the world one final act in the drama. In March of 1815, he left Elba with about 1,000 men, landed in southern France, and began marching north. And as he marched, something extraordinary happened. The soldiers sent to arrest him, veterans who had fought under his command, defected, joined him, entire regiments going over to their old emperor, until by the time he reached Paris, he commanded an army, and King Louis fled, disappeared into the night, leaving Napoleon to reclaim power almost without firing a shot. The 100 days, as this brief restoration would become known, was a feverish time. Napoleon tried to present himself as changed, as constitutional, as ready to rule with moderation, but Europe's powers were not interested in negotiation. They declared him an outlaw, assembled their armies, and prepared to crush this final defiance. The campaign was short. Napoleon moved into Belgium, trying to defeat the Allied armies before they could unite. He caught the Prussians at Ligny and drove them back, but failed to destroy them, and then, on June 18th, 1815, on fields south of Brussels, near a village called Waterloo, he faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, with the Prussians somewhere to the east, their exact position unclear. The Battle of Waterloo was confusion and courage, infantry squares holding against cavalry charges, artillery firing at point-blank range. Wellington's forces bent but did not break, holding a ridge, absorbing assault after assault, and then, in the late afternoon, Prussian forces appeared on Napoleon's flank, tired from their march but arriving in time, and the French position, already strained, collapsed, turned into rout, soldiers throwing down weapons and running, the carefully maintained order dissolving into chaos. Napoleon fled, returned to Paris, abdicated again, this time with no conditions, no negotiated exile, and threw himself on British mercy, hoping for asylum. Instead, he was sent to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, as remote as anywhere on Earth, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean, where escape was impossible, where even hope seemed distant. He would live there for 6 years, dictating memoirs, refighting old battles in conversation, slowly declining in health, until his death in 1821, at age 51, removed from the world stage but never quite forgotten, his legend already beginning to calcify, to transform from the reality of the man into something larger, something mythic. The wars that bore his name, the Napoleonic Wars, had reshaped Europe utterly. More than 3 million soldiers and civilians dead, borders redrawn, political systems transformed, the balance of power fundamentally altered, and in their wake, questions remained about leadership and ambition, about the costs of glory, about what it means when one person's will bends the course of history, and yet, when the smoke cleared, when the armies disbanded and the soldiers returned to their villages and farms, or did not return, when the diplomats finished their work in Vienna and the maps were signed and the treaties ratified, what remained was not just the memory of battles, but something more subtle, more pervasive, a transformation in how people thought about nations, about citizenship, about their relationship to power, because the Napoleonic Wars had done something unexpected. They had spread ideas even as they spread destruction. The armies that marched across Europe carried with them the principles of the French Revolution, equality before the law, merit over birthright, the notion that a government should serve its people rather than the other way around. And even those who fought against Napoleon, even those who died resisting French occupation, absorbed these ideas, could not unhear them once spoken. The nationalism that would reshape the 19th century, that would lead to German and Italian unification, that would ultimately contribute to the catastrophes of the 20th, it was born in part from resistance to Napoleon, from the experience of being occupied, of having foreign soldiers in one's streets, of realizing that one's identity as Prussian or Spanish or Russian mattered, that it was worth fighting for, worth dying for. The military innovations, too, the way Napoleon organized his armies into self-sufficient corps, the emphasis on speed and concentration of force, the use of artillery as a mobile striking weapon rather than static defense, the reliance on living off the land rather than slow-moving supply trains. All of this would influence military thinking for generations. Staff colleges would study his campaigns. Generals would try to replicate his methods, even as they learned from his mistakes, from the hubris that led to Russia, from the inability to know when to stop. And in France itself, the legacy was complicated, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The Napoleonic Code would endure, would be adopted in modified form by dozens of countries, its clarity and rationality a genuine improvement over what came before. The educational institutions he founded would produce leaders and thinkers for centuries. The meritocratic ideal, however imperfectly realized, had been planted too deeply to be entirely uprooted by the Bourbon Restoration. But the cost was written in cemetery records across Europe, in parish registers recording deaths in foreign lands, in the women who never married because there were no men to marry, in the children who grew up fatherless, in the treasury debts that would take generations to repay, in the art looted from conquered cities, in the physical scars left on landscapes where battles were fought, cannonballs still occasionally plowed up in Belgian fields, foundations of burned buildings discovered during construction projects, the earth itself remembering. There is something profoundly human about the story, about a man of extraordinary ability who rose from relative obscurity to reshape the world, who possessed genuine genius alongside equally genuine flaws, who could inspire fierce loyalty and create lasting institutions while also causing suffering on a scale that staggers the imagination. It resists simple judgments, refuses to be only heroic or only villainous, exists instead in that complicated space where most human stories actually unfold. The soldiers who served under him, who survived and grew old, often spoke of those years with a strange mixture of emotions, pride at having been part of something grand, horror at what they had witnessed, nostalgia for youth and comradeship, relief at having survived. They would gather in taverns on anniversaries, wearing old uniforms that no longer fit quite right, and remember, not always accurately, but deeply, the feeling of marching in those great columns, of believing they were making history, of being young and alive when the world seemed infinite with possibility. And perhaps that is the most lasting thing, not the borders that were redrawn or the battles that were won and lost, but the simple fact that ordinary people, farmers and clerks and shopkeepers who became soldiers, had their horizons expanded, saw other countries, other ways of living, experienced things they could never have imagined in their villages, returned changed, if they returned at all, carrying stories that would be retold to children and grandchildren, becoming part of family mythology. The great-grandfather who served in the Grande Armée, who saw Moscow burn, who crossed the Berezina, who was at Waterloo. The years passed, decades, then centuries, and the Napoleonic Wars receded into the comfortable distance of history, no longer living memory, but studied memory, analyzed and debated. The battlefields became tourist sites. Museums displayed uniforms and weapons. Artists painted romantic scenes of cavalry charges and last stands. And slowly, gradually, the specific horror was forgotten, while the general fascination remained. And so we return, in imagination, to that quiet field where we began, where the grass grows tall and the wind moves through it with patient repetition, where the earth has long since absorbed what it once witnessed, where farmers plant crops and children play, unaware or only dimly aware of what happened here. In this place that is simultaneously ordinary and saturated with the past, the afternoon light has shifted, grown softer, more golden, the way it does when the sun begins its slow descent toward evening, and in this gentler illumination, the landscape seems even more peaceful, more removed from anything violent or urgent, just fields and hedgerows, A church steeple in the distance, the smoke from a cottage chimney rising straight up in still air. There is comfort in this, in the way nature reclaims what history has marked, in the persistence of seasons and weather, in the fact that spring always returns, that seeds germinate and flowers bloom regardless of what transpired, that the world continues its slow turning, indifferent to human drama, constant in its inconstancy. I find myself thinking about all those individual lives, the millions of people whose stories we will never know, the conscript from Normandy who died at Eylau, the Prussian officer who surrendered at Jena, the Spanish guerrilla who fought in the mountains, the Russian peasant whose village was burned, the British sailor at Trafalgar, the Austrian gunner at Wagram, each one a complete universe, each one with hopes and fears, with people who loved them, with dreams that ended or were forever altered. History tends to remember the commanders, the emperors and generals whose names appear in accounts, whose decisions shaped campaigns, but the substance of history, the actual human experience of it, belonged to all those others, the unnamed multitudes who marched and fought and suffered and died, or who survived and tried to rebuild, who carried the weight of memory, who had to find ways to live with what they had done and what had been done to them. The wind picks up slightly, moving through the grass with a sound like distant voices, like whispered conversations too far away to distinguish words. And I imagine for a moment that I can hear them, all those voices telling their stories to the empty air, to the patient earth, knowing they will not be answered, not seeking answers, simply testifying to the fact that they existed, that they were here, that their lives mattered. Darkness is beginning to gather at the edges of the sky. Not yet night, but the promise of it, that slow transition when colors deepen and shadows lengthen, when the world takes on a quality of hushed expectation, and it feels appropriate somehow, this gradual fading, this gentle movement from light into darkness, from clarity into mystery. The Napoleonic Wars ended more than 2 centuries ago now. The last veteran died long ago. The last person who remembered hearing first-hand accounts is gone. It exists now only in records and ruins, in museums and memorials, in the ways it shaped what came after, in the invisible currents of cause and effect that still flow through the present, connecting us to that past, whether we know it or not. And perhaps that is enough, to know that it happened, to hold space for the enormity of it, to allow the facts and the feelings to coexist, to recognize both the grandeur and the waste, the brilliance and the brutality, the way individual genius and collective suffering were so tightly braided together as to be inseparable. The field grows dimmer, the details beginning to blur, becoming shapes rather than specifics, and I feel myself stepping back, releasing my grip on the particulars, letting the narrative settle, like dust after a disturbance, slowly returning to rest. There is a bird calling somewhere, a simple repeated note, clearer in the deepening quiet, and a final breeze moves through, touching everything lightly, grass and leaves and the cooling earth, carrying no message, making no claim, simply moving as wind does, as it always has, as it will continue to do, long after every story has been told and forgotten and told again. The light fades further, the horizon becoming indistinct, and I find myself ready to leave this imagined place, this field that is every field and no field, this space where past and present meet and separate, ready to return to my own time, my own concerns, carrying with me perhaps a deeper sense of how quickly moments pass, how vast the sweep of our years, how small and large we all are simultaneously, and in the gathering dusk, in the quiet that settles over everything Peru, there is simply the world, breathing, continuing, holding its history lightly, letting go of nothing, remembering everything in its own silent way. The darkness comes, soft as sleep, deep as earth, and we rest here in this peaceful knowing, this gentle understanding that all things pass and all things remain, held in the patient memory of the land itself.